Hello, everybody. This is Marian Merritt, and I want to welcome you to the FISSEA Winter Forum. This is one in a series of quarterly events for the FISSEA community. And I am, as I said, Marian Merritt. I'm the Deputy Director of NICE at NIST, and I'm your co-host today, co-host for today's event. So we have a wonderful set of presenters and presentations for you today that should be highly impactful for each of you. And it should help inform your daily work as federal educators and cybersecurity and privacy professionals. So as I've hopefully indicated, I'm really excited about today's speakers and the content they're going to share with you. And I hope that you'll find this to be a meaningful afternoon and well spent time. So your host for the rest of today's agenda is one of our wonderful FISSEA volunteer co-chairs, Frauke Steinmeier. So now over to you and my wonderful colleague, Frauke.
Thank you, Marian. Hello and welcome to the FISSEA Winter Forum. I'm your host, Frauke Steinmeier, and I represent the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, as the program manager of a national cybersecurity program aimed at providing no-cost cybersecurity curriculum and professional development to K-12 students and educators. And together with Brooke Crisp, who is unable to join us today, we are your FISSEA co-chairs. What is FISSEA? FISSEA is a community of federal information security educators whose goals are to strengthen cybersecurity awareness and training programs in the federal environments. The FISSEA Forums are quarterly meetings to provide opportunities for policy and programmatic updates, the exchange of best practices, and discussion and engagement among members of the Federal Information Security Educators FISSEA community. We've got some exciting presentations lined up for you today. Before jumping into the presentations, let's do a little housekeeping. So we encourage everyone to participate year-round in FISSEA by joining the FISSEA email distribution list at FISSEA updates plus subscribe at list.nist.gov, volunteering for the planning committee, volunteer by sending an email request to FISSEA@nist.gov, serving on the 2025 award or contest committees, volunteer by sending an email to FISSEA@nist.gov, submitting presentation proposals for future FISSEA conference or FISSEA forums. We're always accepting speaker proposals on a rolling basis, and we'll be using submitted proposals to build our future event agendas. So be sure to submit your agendas through http://www.surveymonkey.com/r/FISSEA call for presentations. Save the date for FISSEA Spring Forum, which is happening on May 13th, 2025. More information to be found at www.nist.gov/news/events/34th-annual-FISSEA-conference. And then some final logistic reminders: the presentation slides that you will see and a recording of today's conference will be available online. Please type in your questions into the Q&A or chat section at the bottom right corner of your screen. We will answer as many questions as possible at the conclusion of each presentation today, so be sure to ask all of the questions that you have. So to begin us today, we've got the lovely Sandra Scott Hayward. So Dr. Scott Hayward is an associate professor with the School of Electronics, Electrical Engineering, and Computer Science, and a member of the Centre for Secure Information Technologies at Queen's University Belfast, or QUB. She began her career in industry and became a chartered engineer in 2006, joining academia. She has contributed security designs and solutions for softwareized networks based on her research on network security architectures and security functions for emerging networks. specifically considering threat detection and protection mechanisms in programmable networks. Dr. Scott Hayward, thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to hear about your topic, Excite, exploring the enhancement of cybersecurity training through immersive technology.
Thank you very much, Franca. Next slide, please. So thank you very much. And today I'm here to talk a little bit about a project that we worked on for university students, cybersecurity training through immersive technology. Next slide, please. I'm going to apologize in advance because there's a lot of next slide pleases as we go through, but I'll just drop gently onto a few of them to highlight a few things. So the first thing I wanted to mention, Frank obviously kindly introduced me. I'm from Queen's University in Belfast, and we have an award from the UK National Cybersecurity Centre for excellence in cybersecurity education. Now, that's relevant to this piece of work that we've done because I'm coming from the Centre for Secure Information Technologies, which is our research institute, and we have a similar Centre of Excellence in Research, which is related to the school that we mentioned, so electrical, electronic engineering, computer science, and all the technical piece of work that we do in cybersecurity at Queen's. What's different about the Academic Centre of Excellence in Cybersecurity Education is that it's a university-wide, so an institution-wide award. And that means what we're really trying to do is raise awareness of cybersecurity with all of our staff, all of our students across all disciplines. Next slide, please. And as part of that, we also do outreach. So we do industry outreach, we work with the public sector, and then also with Cyber First Schools, which is an accreditation program for UK schools, looking at bringing cybersecurity to the curriculum for young people as well, and developing that pipeline to educate and train people in cybersecurity. So what I'm showing on the screen is just one of our newsletters from last quarter. So you'll be aware that October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and we did a whole range of different activities with schools, with students, internally with staff, and also our Queen's Cybersecurity Society also hosted some of their own events. Next slide, please. So this particular piece of work is linked, as I said, to the student cybersecurity awareness, and we present it to all of our students. We have about 25,000 students at Queen's, undergraduate and postgraduate. And the idea here is to give them this set of immersive experiences that I'm going to show you today, but then also a backdrop of resources that they can go to read a bit more about cybersecurity practices, and also today do and take some quizzes. Next slide, please. So the gap that we identified, you're probably familiar with a lot of the resources out there for industry and enterprise. So for example, the SANS Institute in the UK, the National Cybersecurity Centre have some resources. There are also resources from the Open University, publicly available, and various schools resources as well. We found a lot of material available for teaching younger people, but there was this gap for the university or third level students, something that would be really relatable to them and interesting and accessible, and that also would be more effective in terms of retaining the information than what we describe here as 1D and 2D training materials. So those are really the idea of just reading something and answering some questions, or you might be familiar with a piece of training where you're presented with a scenario or even a little PowerPoint or a video, you watch it and then answer some questions. It's very one-dimensional. And from experience, the studies say that it's not particularly high in terms of retention of that information. Next slide, please. So we got some funding for a first phase of research on this, and what we proposed to do was to actually find out from the students what they would look for. So we gathered a group of students across all the disciplines. So we have 3 faculty at Queen's. Engineering and physical sciences, which I'm part of, arts, humanities and social sciences, and then medical and health and life sciences. So getting students from each of those and supported by my colleagues, so co-investigators from each of those faculty as well. We gathered the students, undergraduate, postgraduate, And we put those different materials to them, the different resources that are, as I said before, designed for either industry, so for for staff, employees, or for a school level, and ask them to look at those, answer some questions about them, and identify what they felt was whether the material was relatable, whether it was relevant, whether it was new information to them, etc. And also background, like whether they had previous cybersecurity experience. So if we can go next slide just twice, I think we'll pull up to, and again, please, Calvin. Thank you. So out of doing that, we set them the materials and the surveys to do in their own time. And then we had focus groups with them, a number of different focus groups. And from that, we discussed their findings and their experiences with it. We also presented augmented reality and virtual reality to them from different domains, but some example experiences so they could get an idea about what you might be able to do in that particular environment if you were in a virtual reality environment, for example. And as an outcome of that was what you see on the screen here, some requirements or recommendations really at this point that we suggested around the format and presentation of structure of the material. So the idea of bringing in case studies or specifics, characters that would bring a scenario to life. They definitely wanted to be able to self-check and to either answer things or to do things themselves. They were thought that the 3D technology could be valuable, and particularly from the perspective of cybersecurity, where you often experience a cybersecurity attack or become affected by it if you're in a stressful situation or if you're under time pressure. For example, we all know the issues of clicking on a link by accident if you're looking for something else. So they thought that that could be brought to life a bit within the virtual reality environment. And then in terms of content, you can see a couple of examples there. Obviously, they wanted it to be relevant and relatable in those materials we showed. Because we didn't find any that were student focused, they lacked that addressing of student work and student environment. It was interesting to discover their lack of awareness of the digital footprint. And they were quite interested by that, and talked about sharing that with their friends and family as well on discovery of it. So that was definitely something that they felt that should be presented to a student population. Also social media use, and I can come back to that one in terms of an experience that we ended up developing, because as I mentioned, we're looking at all different disciplines, and there are several disciplines, for example, nursing and midwifery and pharmacy, among others, that require professional accreditation, where the students are going to graduate with a professional accreditation. So those bodies require that they be very careful about their behavior in such forums as social media. So learning and becoming aware of that would be quite important for those students, and indeed for all students. So a couple of other things on there in terms of practical guidance, how-tos, and then the C5 there got on the screen is about relating to international students. And this was done a number of years ago because there's been a few phases to the work. And one of the things that has come up over those years is that a lot of our international students across the UK have been targeted by scams, for example, by immigration authorities or fake people representing as coming from immigration authorities. So we had that bit of information because we had some international students and staff represented in the focus groups that fed back those experiences that we were able to later build into the piece of work. But this is the backdrop idea of some of the things that the students felt would be valuable if we're looking to develop new cybersecurity material that was directed towards them. Next slide, please. So we were lucky enough then to be successful in applying for some follow-on funding, a more significant bit of funding over a longer period that we're able to then design and develop these experiences. Next slide, please. So the two things we aimed to do with this we had the idea of doing something a little bit more novel. So taking the opportunity to explore developing a virtual reality experience. So we designed the VR headset application with the view of being able to do that with small groups of students. So obviously, as I mentioned, we have a very large student population, so it wouldn't be reasonable to expect all of our students to be able to get into a headset to take the training. So we had the headset for road shows and rolling out and demonstrations. So that was the main development. And then we developed on the back of that a desktop application, so we could make that available to the students within a virtual learning environment. They could download it and run it also on their own device. It would also be available on university machines. And then the wider population would be able to take this training. Next slide, please. So next slide and next slide, just to get the bullet points on here, please. Thank you very much. So I mentioned the three faculties represented. So this was fully interdisciplinary. That was quite unique about the project. Also the student focus. So following on from phase one, where the students actually co-designed the requirements for the training. We then also introduced here several stages of feedback from them, so that we could constantly make sure that we were what we were developing was actually going to be something that they considered to be usable and relatable and meeting their expectations. And then I've also highlighted there the company that we collaborated with, that were Zuber Virtual Reality, who are experienced in immersive digital content creation. So we developed the content and they developed the media. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So here you just get an illustration of some of the sort of mock-ups. What we did first was look at the environment. You can see in the backdrop of the image on the right-hand side, that's the Queen's old building. It's the Lanyon building at Queen's, and there's a quad. And we had this idea that we would use the spaces around Queen's to actually engage and then hold that hopefully in memory for the students, that they would, if they were walking around some of these areas, that then it might be more memorable. It might come back to them, some of the cybersecurity experiences or training that they'd looked at before. So we presented different styles to them, and they then identified that the student room, as in a student accommodation room, library environment, maybe a cafe, would support some good experiences. And the ideas we had were around the likes of social engineering, social media use, password awareness, phishing awareness, etc. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And next slide, and next slide. Thanks. So that gives you an idea. So what we had was then a bit of information from them about the direction we were taking the design and the development. Then we mocked up a couple of prototype experiences with the content that we planned to include in it. So you've got 3 examples there: password guidance, phishing awareness, and secure remote working. 2 of those were reasonably flat, so they take place in the library environment. They are all interactive, so the student is actually doing something or selecting something. There are timers there that they can see how long that they're taking to do something. Some of the activities are timed. And then the one that's fully visible, the secure remote working or studying, this is a cafe at Queen's. And the idea here was that students would identify good and bad practices with devices and applications that they were working with within that environment. So the feedback we were looking for, we got them to play with these and identify things that they came up with were either wanting more time to complete an activity, whether if they found it more difficult to navigate in a space, we were able to adjust that. To know if they were looking in that secure remote working example, they were looking for a number of devices and to be able to tell how many they'd found at some point in time. And then other things that we thought of through the process and the discussion with them was, at this point, we were also running different campaigns. So for World Password Day, for example, we had done a poster campaign and awareness on our lock screens of the university PCs. giving us the simple password guidance. So we actually decided to include that sort of imagery in the backdrop in the library example. So we would have posted on the wall there on the lock screen devices within the library environment that we were creating. So we were able to build on that. Next slide, please. And finally, then we had the final build that we were able to present to the groups of students, and you can see them here trying it out in the headsets. So we got them to walk through the experiences from beginning to end. Interesting things that we kind of discovered, they wanted more information often, even if it was to read the information on the screen, and you'll see that. I'll show you in a moment the final set. And also that they were happy enough to spend a reasonable amount of time. When we started this, we expected it would just be a couple of minutes of an experience, and that would be the limit of attention. But they actually wanted approximately 5 minutes per experience, and we ended up with 8 of them. So it is a reasonable amount of time to spend in the training, but they were very keen and engaged in doing it, certainly within the headsets themselves. So next slide, please. And next slide, please. And next slide, please. So I'm going to skip over these. These are just sort of highlighting some of the things that I've mentioned already about how we fulfilled that set of initial requirements from phase 1 by including different examples. I will mention the social media use one, where I described the fact that the nursing and midwifery and pharmacy, for example, and their professional accreditations. So we got input from colleagues who are on the ACSC team in terms of staff to help us to develop the content for those experiences. And we excluded digital footprint experiences as they requested. We included some feedback opportunities, the training, and various other different things in there. So at this point, I'm going to just share my screen, and then we'll come back to the slides if that's okay. So perhaps if you can let me, I can't screen share just at the moment.
Susie or Calvin, are you able to permit screen share?
I can wait until the end of this slide set if you prefer, but it might be a nice time to share that.
Do you see the share button at the lower part of your screen?
Yes, I get the message you cannot screen share while the other participant is sharing.
Ah. So
okay, looks like
right,
that's resolved. Okay, and then we'll share this. Can you see this okay?
Yes.
Great. So this is basically what the students will encounter when they open. This is just a shortened video of it. They'll obviously get a set of instructions to walk through. They then get guided through, and we specifically set it up that they were taking the experiences in order, because we do use a little bit of repetition then in some of them that you'll see. So here, for example, on the right-hand side, you can see some of our messaging that we've used for World Password Day. They're seeing the actual completed results. And one of the bits that they requested was the likes of those tips to get the feedback on what they had done correctly and what they had done not quite right. So the examples of some phishing emails, things that they might need to look for and capture. They go through an example, and then they do another one from scratch. We also included sort of quick question, or sort of a good an issue at the beginning of the experience, and then when they exit the experience, they get a positive messaging out of that. This is one where we're showing the scam that I mentioned. So here is an example of different issues that might arise. This is particularly, there's a lot of different things happening for them as they go through this. They hear phone calls coming in, the sliding under the door and things like that. So perhaps there's a lot of things happening, and that they might then, by accident, click a link or something like that. Couple of different environments that we're using. This is one of the accommodation, and they look at the different examples of devices they might use just to recognize some of the vulnerabilities. and to identify the fact that there is communication between those devices and what that means in terms of what your information you're sharing. So there's both a privacy aspect to this and the cybersecurity in terms of technical implementations. So this is the one that I mentioned before, that we have the set of devices that we identify good and bad practices. And then a further one where they've got an example of somebody coming to their room to work on a project with them, and then they have to identify all the potential vulnerabilities before that person comes to join them, things that person might capture about information about them. This is a social media use example. So they've got to select whether a post is appropriate or inappropriate. And then some things obviously that you should never post. And then it just sums up going over the examples of the experiences they've had, and it just a little bit of a reminder about what they should do, and kind of a Queen's related example about their training. So they're directed then to how to report an incident locally. So I'm going to stop sharing there, and perhaps we could share the slides again, Calvin. Perfect, thank you so much. So what we've done then, since that was the end of the development of the virtual reality and the desktop experience, we then ran some road shows outside that group. And next slide, please. And what you can see here is the students that were involved in the development of the site actually helped us then to train other students. So they were involved in the road shows that we held around the university. Next slide, please. So you can see, if you go next slide, because unfortunately these were designed for me to go through really fast. So if you just keep going until we got a lot of positive feedback, not just from internally from the students and those groups that we'd worked with. We've also taken this out to schools and to school the events, I should say, and also to industry, and they're surprisingly quite interested in it as well. Even though we weren't targeting that audience, I think the engagement with the virtual reality or a 3D experience is quite attractive. I mentioned already that we built this into the virtual learning environment. So this is roughly what the students would see. And go next slide, please. And next slide again. And then they do have, and in some of those requirements that I mentioned, they were looking, some students do actually prefer to take a bit more time at the material to read through it. So there is an option to go back, and we have other links and other information, little snippets of advisories, for example, specific media articles relating to scams that might, raise awareness again about just, okay, well, this actually happens in reality. This isn't just something that was made up for the training. Next slide, please. One other thing just to highlight before I come to the end then is the students often want a reward for completing something. There are two things I'd highlight on these slides. In the bottom left-hand side, you can see just a user ID. So we did talk to them about what information they'd be willing to share, and they definitely wanted that to be minimal. So we don't have them register with their Queen's student ID or anything, or name. They just use a user ID, and we can use that then to check their completion in a back-end database. They then get this little cup at the end of each of they wanted kind of an acknowledgement at the end of each experience, so they gather those as they go through. And then for a smaller population, so some of our schools where we've got fewer students completing it, it's more manageable, we do a certificate for them, so they can request a certificate of completion. Something still to do is to do a badge, a digital badge version of that might be more scalable. Next slide, please. And then in terms of improvements, we subsequently had a follow-on to try and improve. We found with the desktop version, it was Microsoft, so it was Windows-based, which was challenging for and not accessible to everybody. So we developed a web browser version of it, which is now much more easily accessible for all students on any platform. And we also had, I mentioned at the beginning, the ACSE program. Well, there are another, I think, 10 universities across the UK that are ACSE holders. And they were also very interested. We wanted to be able to share this, this resource. So we did a non-branded version, which has sort of generic university, as in your university rather than Queen's throughout, which those other universities can then also adapt to include their own, and also to include specific links. So for example, I mentioned the incident reporting or other emails that we've a couple of links throughout the experiences that are specific to Queen's, and they can be replaced with your own university. And then finally, just to facilitate things, we did a demo VR version with just 2 of the experiences that was much quicker and much easier for their students and for others helping with the road shows to deploy. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. And we have also, just for reference, we have a book chapter that describes the backdrop to this and most of what I've explained to you today. And next slide, please. So that is my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott Hayward, for telling us about your programs and how you formed it and what you found. We will now field a couple of questions. As a reminder to our attendees, please type your questions into the Q&A section, and let's get to it. We'll answer as many questions as possible and then move on to our next speaker. So the first question we have is, can you explain how the VR application enhances the learning environment? Now, I know you talked about this a little bit already. Could you go a little bit more into it?
Yes, absolutely. So what we found was with the virtual reality environment, you can put somebody into a space so that they're feeling a bit more, well, several aspects to it. One is that you can include yourself in it. So you can exclude the wider world, so you can focus much more directly. So if I'm sitting here watching this screen, looking at it, there are other things in my peripheral vision that are distracting me from learning potentially, or listening to what I'm hearing. Whereas if I put on the headset, then I'm immersed in that environment. So my focus is purely on what's going on in that space. So you can really target the learning and the training around what you show in that space. And I think even potentially, I mean, I'm not an expert in virtual reality by any means, not even a tiny bit, but you can put things into that environment, like the imaging that I mentioned. So those landscapes or the backdrops of posters that have messaging in there that also catch the eye of someone. So you can really create a space that is focused on whatever you're trying to train in our case, is cybersecurity. The second thing is that you have, I mentioned this already, about the time pressures and things like that. So you can constrain the environment to meet whatever kind of feel that you're trying to give. And then obviously we were able to put students into spaces that we felt that they would then see and go back to, and that might remind them of the training that they did. So in our experience, the students who have had the opportunity to use the virtual reality have found it very interesting, exciting. Not all of them have tried it before. Those that have tried it before also found it a useful tool to engage with.
Thank you. Another question is, can you talk a little bit about the languages that were used to creating this? For example, JavaScript, Python. What did you guys use, and what were your thoughts behind which ones to use?
So we didn't actually do the development of the platform itself. So they use various 3D imaging engines in the back end. So that was Zuber Virtual Reality's work. So they worked on that. The piece that we did was we just integrated the database and for the hosting of the web platform. So it's I'm not sure exactly what they I think Angular they probably used in the 3D, but I don't think they would have used JavaScript or Python in this case.
Thank you. Is your VR program one of a kind, or are there others like this that we can look at?
So as far as I know, this is the only one of the type. When we went for the first phase, when we went to look at companies that had VR, there are some examples or some smaller UK companies that have more industry focused, where they were running a cybersecurity challenge in that sort of interactive environment. They might have had multiple player games, but not designed for this audience or with this particular content type. So more in a game environment or a capture the flag type challenge environment. There are probably others that could be looked at.
Did you produce an output document that summarizes all of the learnings from converting from the VR version to the laptop desktop browser version? I know you were showing a lot of data that you had from your research.
So we didn't actually do it for the conversion, because so the developers developed it for VR and then did a relatively simple, from their description, conversion or use of it for the desktop. What was challenging then was to redevelop that in the web version. It wasn't as straightforward as I think they anticipated. When we planned it out, it took a bit longer than we expected with some of the challenges. And I think that probably was just how they had designed and built it. So perhaps in hindsight, maybe going direct to the web version would have been the way to go, but lessons learned and all that.
This available? I know you were talking about other schools using this. Is this only for use in your country? Is it available for everyone anywhere? And follow-up question to that, if not, how scalable is it, or how recreatable is it for others to do with their companies, agencies, or countries?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly happy to discuss it with people. So the stage we're at the moment is with the other universities. We obviously did the build that's generic. That would then require the university, and that is it's not open source directly, but it's government owned in the UK, and they're willing to share it, if that makes sense. It's designed with the idea of the funding was to create something that would be shareable. So what we're looking at the moment is where that gets hosted. There is a platform, CSE Connect, where some of those artifacts could be. And I'm happy to discuss that with anybody. If you're interested in it, maybe drop me an email and we can talk about the steps that we're going through for that.
Thank you. And last question, what does the future hold for this, and what advice would you give to other educators who want to start a similar program? Any key lessons or takeaways?
Well, I would say certainly if you want to do something similar, look at this. So you can actually try out on our QB ACSE website. We have the link to the web browser version. So certainly try it out and start from there, maybe, so you're not starting from scratch again. So that would be a definite recommendation. I think in terms of the content, there are probably evolutions on that. So we tried to keep them reasonably forward thinking, so they are future proof, let's say. But I think there are probably additional materials that could be added in there, and new experiences that could add to it. So rather than reinventing the wheel, just building on it, I think would be really nice for the community.
All right, thank you so much. It looks like we've got 1 more minute, so maybe we can take one last question. We've got, has there been any measurement to the efficacy of improving cybersecurity awareness for, say, fewer incidents?
So our experience is basic across the university. So we do run phishing exercises, and we do run so sending out phishing emails that you then expect people to raise a flag on. And the response to that has improved significantly since we started doing the various activities we've had with the training, both for staff and students. So it's a small example. We haven't had an extensive evaluation phase to see. We're tracking the number of completions and things, and the improvements, and the reduced number of incidents in the university. But the phishing example will probably be the best in terms of our reporting rate is far higher than it used to be, which indicates that people are recognizing the signs.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming out to talk to us. I know I learned a lot. I think this sounds really like a fun program. I'd like to try it out myself. For everyone else who's joining us today, there is contact information in the webinar chat if you want to reach out for more information. So with that, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. And now let's move on to our next speaker.
Thank you very much.
Today, we are honored to welcome Dr. Kurt Adams. Dr. Adams is a renowned advocate, leader, and keynote speaker specializing in disability inclusion and leadership. He serves as the managing director of Innovative Impact LLC, where he champions impactful workforce inclusion and accessible innovations. With decades of experience, Dr. Adams has transformed workplaces and influenced corporate strategies, ensuring accessibility and inclusivity are prioritized. His leadership continues to pave the way toward a more equitable and innovative future. Dr. Adams, thank you so much for joining us today. We are excited to hear about your topic, supercharging the cybersecurity industry through disability inclusion.
Well, I am thrilled to be here to talk about this, and let's just do one visual check. Am I okay on screen, centered and all good things?
Look amazing. Yes.
Okay, awesome. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the speaker. I'm talking to you from my home office in Seattle. I am a totally blind person. My retinas both detached when I was in kindergarten. So I was a sighted kid one day and a blind kid a couple days later. And I went to a school for blind children for first, second, and third grade, the Oregon State School for the Blind. And I was really given 3 gifts there that now as a researcher, I know are strong predictors of thriving as an adult in employment. And we want all of our blind kids to get these 3 gifts. One is blindness skills. There are specialized skills and tools and techniques that we need in order to be efficient and effective and thrive in the built digital and social environments that we live in. I was also given high expectations. The school expected, there were 110, 120 blind kids, K-8. We were expected to be at grade level unless we had another developmental disability. My parents, they were very young. They were in their mid-20s when I became blind. They were both teachers. My dad was a high school basketball coach. They didn't want to see anything less than an A on a report card and expected their kids to be involved in school activities and sports, etc. And then the last thing was this strong internal locus of control, which just means that I was taught as a 6, 7, 8-year-old, in my bones that I could do what I wanted to do with my life. I could overcome problems. I could figure things out. And they did that through a lot of experiences, taking us backpacking in the Three Sisters Wilderness area and horseback riding and building snow forts on Mount Hood and being down in the tide pools and on the Oregon coast. So those 3 things were gifted to me. And I did very well in school. I received a full scholarship to Whitman College in Walla Walla. I graduated Phi Beta Kappa, cum laude. And then I faced the reality that so many of us with significant disabilities face in not being able to find employment. So I had applied to some grad schools, gotten in. I decided I wanted to marry my college sweetheart and buy a house and have kids, which I've done. So been married 39 years now, and our 2 grandchildren are here today. So that all happened, but there was a long road to follow. I was applying for jobs, getting a phone interview, having it go great. I would walk into the in-person interview with my long white cane and my slate and stylus to take notes in Braille, and the confusion would set in across the desk with the employer who, not surprisingly, had probably never worked with a blind person before, did not know the tools and training and techniques we use, so could not conceptualize how could this blind kid do this financial analyst job he's applying for. So I had that experience of dozens and dozens of interviews. Finally was offered a securities sales position selling tax-free municipal bonds over the phone, which I did for 10 years. 50 cold calls a day, every day. And then when I turned 30, I decided to reevaluate and decide what I wanted to do the rest of my life. So I pivoted to the nonprofit sector. I actually used the What Color is Your Parachute book out of the Braille library, followed all the exercises, and got clear that I should be in the nonprofit sector. I should be involved in organizations that create opportunities for people who are blind. So that's what I've devoted the last 30 plus years to, is creating opportunities for other people with disabilities, blind people in particular, to thrive. I did earn a PhD in leadership and change fairly recently, finished it 6 years ago, and I did an ethnographic study of blind adults employed in large American corporations, and got a deep understanding of the factors that led to their success and also the challenges that they faced. The next slide is called the challenge. I should have called it the opportunity. You know, we know there's 700,000 plus unfilled cybersecurity jobs in the US. We also know that about 70% of people who are blind and all people with significant disabilities, about 70% of us are not in the workforce. So there's an overlooked and underutilized talent pool. And this starts with our first jobs. Less than 23% of us have any paid work by the time we're 23 years old. And over 70% of the general population, our brothers and sisters and neighbors and classmates, over 70% have some sort of paid work by the time they're 23. And you know, K-12 is where it all happens, where it all starts. And I talked about the gifts I was given as a first, second, and third grader. At some point in your life as a blind student, you get this wonderful news that there's this thing called the expanded core curriculum. That means, young blind kid, you need to learn everything the sighted kids learn and 9 more things. So you need to learn how to travel independently using a white cane. You need to learn how to use assistive technology. You need to learn Braille. You need to learn how to you need to learn self-advocacy. And you need career exploration. As we find that data shows, research shows that our blind high school graduates have a much less complete understanding of the possible career pathways in various occupations compared to their sighted classmates. So we are focused here on the cybersecurity careers, and the program I'm going to talk about, the APEX program, prepares blind people for careers in cybersecurity and prepares people to earn the CompTIA Network Plus and Security Plus certification. So just wanted to note here that people can earn those certifications as young as age 13. And we'll talk about the vocational rehabilitation system in a bit. But young people with disabilities are eligible to receive vocational rehabilitation services from their state at age 14. So we can begin working with kids before they're ready for employment in the pre-employment transition services, pre-ETS phase, and in the school to work transition phase. And why are only 30% of us working? Research shows that the battling for number 1 and number 2 reason are employer perceptions and transportation. Also low expectations, the inaccessibility of the productivity tools used in the workplace, the lack of training and the skills and abilities that are demanded by the workplace. So the next slide, the APEX program. Prior to starting my consulting practice 2.5 years ago, I was privileged to be the president and CEO of the American Foundation for the Blind, which is the oldest, most iconic blindness organization. It was Helen Keller's organization. And I moved into that role, moved to New York City from Seattle in 2016 into that role. And in 2017 through 2019, we undertook very rigorous research to identify industries and careers that we could focus on to really move the needle of that, only 30% of us working. And we identified 3 areas. One was digital health, one was contract management, the third was cybersecurity. And when I left AFB and moved back to Seattle, started my consulting practice, I was connected with a privately held, very entrepreneurial cybersecurity company called NovaCoast. It's NovaCoast, novacoast.com. Global, I work a lot with global financial institutions. They have SOCs, security operations centers in the US and UK. They're standing one up in Shannon, Ireland right now. Super interesting company, very forward thinking. They have a federal practice. They have a conference business. They host 2 conferences where they bring 110, 120 chief information security officers, CISOs together. They have a staffing business and they have a training business. And they had found, trying to stand up a SOC in Michigan, they could not find enough entry-level qualified people to hire, so they developed a training program. They saw a business opportunity. They understood other employers would also have challenges in finding enough qualified applicants. So they created this training business online to prepare people to enter the industry. And then the question was asked, have you ever considered training blind people to enter the cybersecurity industry? And the people at Novica said, no, we have never considered that. But them being who they are, they did consider it. They partnered with a blindness agency in Wichita, Kansas, where they have a SOC called Envision, to make the 200 hours of training accessible for blind people like myself who use screen reading software. Worked with CompTIA, worked with Pearson VUE to make sure the tests were accessible, and set up a model whereby the training and testing is paid for by state vocational rehabilitation agencies. We're set up as vendors in 23 states now. And then when people complete the training and earn the certifications, there's assistance in job placement through the NovaCoast staffing activity, their staffing department. So working on this stuff for over 30 years, if I were going to draw something up from scratch, it would look a lot like this, the APEX program. It's preparing people for high demand careers. The training, the testing, and the productivity tools are very accessible for those of us using screen readers. The certifications are more valuable in the industry than the traditional 2- and 4-year degrees. A lot of the jobs are remote, so eliminate some of those transportation barriers. And there's just a myriad of career pathways and opportunities for upward mobility once people get the foot on the ladder. So the next slide talks about multi-sector alignment, and there's a book that's a little bit of a heavy read, but it's called Forces for Good. And researchers studied 12 social movements that had true impact. And they concluded that in order for anything really transformational to happen in our society, that 4 sectors need to be aligned: the community, the corporate, the government, and the nonprofit. And the first organization they studied was Habitat for Humanity, and how it started out volunteers building some houses for some people, and now it is a global force for equity, housing justice, an economic engine. The next thing I want to touch on is disability as strength. And again, I'm a researcher, so a book called The Talent Code, I recommend. It talks about how do people develop strengths? How do world-class athletes become world-class athletes? Chess champions become chess champions, premier musicians. And it's through overcoming challenges, and increasingly difficult challenges. And sometimes those challenges are created intentionally. As I studied piano and learned the scales and the basics, and then some pieces, and then harder pieces, and into the more complex classical pieces. That was intentional. There was a program. Living with a disability every day in our world, which is not constructed to accommodate us, we are faced with challenges constantly. And we have the opportunity to develop strengths that are really unique. in areas like resilience and perseverance and grit and creative problem solving and the ability to analyze and manage risk and how to work in diverse teams and how to listen and how to communicate. And those are all characteristics that employers say they need and want in employees. I was meeting with a group of blind high school students here in Seattle last summer, and one young man, very sharp young cat. He was entering a senior year. He wanted to work. His brothers and sisters and friends were all getting jobs, and he was applying for some entry-level jobs. And not surprisingly, having a similar experience to mine and not getting hired. And I said, I don't know you well. We've only talked here for half an hour, but I guarantee you have done things that the other kids applying for these jobs haven't done, because you're a blind kid and you've lived your life and you are successful in school. And so I don't know what it is. Maybe you worked on your family farm. Maybe you took care of your younger brothers and sisters. Maybe you did a really cool, amazing science project as a blind person. So shine a spotlight on that. You have strengths and characteristics that your peers don't, because you've had to develop those. The next slide is success through partnerships, and we talked about the sectors. The community, Nova Coast and the Apex program were very tied into the blindness community. There are two national organizations, the National Federation of the Blind, the American Council of the Blind. They all have state chapters and local chapters and members who are very active, interested in supporting each other and thriving. So when we become connected with the state so that the state vocational rehabilitation agency can pay for the training and certifications, we reach out to the state and local presidents of the federation and the council, and we set up times to talk to their members. And we want to create that awareness of the cybersecurity industry as a fertile career field for people who are blind, and that there are pathways and that we have created them, and they're here. The next is corporate leadership. There is an organization called disabilityin.org. It's 470 corporations who have committed to hiring people with disabilities. Two that I know very well, Microsoft, which is across the lake here, and Walgreens, have really intentionally included people with disabilities, and they've tracked their return on investment, as has DuPont and some others. But they have found that if a work group, a department, a company, division hire significant numbers of people with significant disabilities, if they reach about a 20% of the workforce being people with disclosed disabilities, a lot of really great things happen to the culture. The turnover is lower, absenteeism is lower, safety is better, employee satisfaction is higher, customer perception is better, and there are companies doing it, and I'm happy to introduce you to those companies. It's great to visit. If you're within striking distance of Anderson, South Carolina, go to the Walgreens distribution center. Of their 550 employees, 40% are people with severe developmental disabilities. It is their most productive warehouse and distribution center, again, with the lowest absenteeism, lowest turnover, best employee satisfaction, best safety record. It's a great place to visit. And then the vocational rehabilitation model, the next slide is the government piece. As we talked about the four sectors, so every state has vocational rehabilitation agencies. Some of them have one to serve all people with disabilities. 30 of them have two, one for people who are blind, one for everyone else. Helen Keller was a great organizer, so she went state by state in the 30s and 40s and worked with state legislatures to set up commissions for the blind. So here's some things the vocational rehabilitation in your state can do. And they can start doing these things for people as young as age 14. If you're an employer, you can understand your needs and bring you qualified applicants. They can assess a workplace for accessibility They can pay for specialized hardware and software needed for a disabled employee. They can provide your disabled employee with the necessary training to effectively use that hardware and software. They can cover costs for paid internships and summer work experiences for young people. They can pay for salaries during on-the-job training. And our research at AFB showed that less than 10% of companies who said they wanted to hire people with disabilities are connected with the vocational rehabilitation system. The next piece is the nonprofit network. So in any community of any size, there are one or more community-based nonprofits that are focused on supporting employment of people with disabilities. And they have philanthropic dollars, they have trained staff, they have networks. They can provide a lot of support for schools, training programs, employers, families. Lighthouse for the Blind here in Seattle, the Lighthouse for Blind in Chicago and San Francisco, Vibrant Works in San Antonio, Beyond Vision in Milwaukee, Alpha Point in Kansas City. There's 150 of them. I know them all. So if you would like to be connected to a community-based nonprofit in your community, please do let me know. And then finally, I'd love to have Q&A, but just a call to action. We have a website, it's the apexprogram.com. And if you are interested at any level in helping accelerate inclusion of people with disabilities in the cybersecurity industry, we would love to talk to you. I have a bunch of email addresses, but for this purpose, probably the kadams@novacoast.com would be a great way to get in touch. And I will talk about employment and thriving and careers of people with disabilities all day long. So please do feel free to reach out to me. And back to you, Fraka.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. Thank you for sharing your experiences and the important work you do. I had a chance to see some of these screen readers in action at a conference not that long ago, and I got to meet some of the cyber students who are graduating from some of the programs you had mentioned. It is just incredible the work that they and you are doing. So thank you for using your words to, as you put it, shine a spotlight on this topic, and for sharing information on how we can get involved. We will now field a couple of questions. As a reminder to our attendees, please type your questions into the chat or Q&A section at the bottom right hand of your screen. We will answer as many questions as possible. All right, so let's start off. So this person said that they applaud Nova Coast, and do you think that this scheme could go worldwide? You'd mentioned that it actually is in a couple of countries, and they have pilots in Shannon and other places.
Yeah, so it's interesting because there's an organization called Vision Ireland, and it is a nonprofit that basically provides a comprehensive suite of services for blind people in Ireland. And when Nova Coast planned to open a SOC in Shannon, we contacted them right away. Nova Coast staff visited the leadership of Vision Ireland, where we have several Irish students in the program now. I'm talking with Canadian National Institute for the Blind in Toronto, Vision Australia, and the New Zealand Foundation for the Blind. So really the US, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand at this point.
Thank you so much. You had mentioned some of the degrees that students as young as 13 can get. Now, I know that the CompTIA Security Plus, you need to renew it every 3 years. So
right.
Essentially, they'd need to, if they got the certification at 13, they'd still need to renew it at 16. But that aside, what level degree does one need to qualify as an entry-level cybersecurity worker? And is there any specific thing that we're looking for with someone who is blind, visually impaired, or disabled?
Yeah. As I mentioned, Students with disabilities are eligible in the US for vocational rehabilitation services at age 14. And if you have a disabled young person in your life, you should march them right on down to the vocational rehabilitation agency. And the first step is to create an individual employment plan. And the Network Plus and Security Plus certifications, if earned during school, yes, they need to be renewed, but that can be built into the plan. And so the continuing education can be built in and planned for and paid for. So there's just so many untapped resources available through the state vocational rehabilitation agencies. We're telling folks that, you know, a 2-year degree, a 4-year degree, great, computer science, IT, technology, but really the certifications for the entry level, getting the foot on the ladder. We asked CISOs, as I mentioned, Nova Coast has a conference business. They have a conference called Innovate, and I had a chance to talk to 70 or 80 chief information security officers as we evolved the program, and asked them, you know, what are you looking for in entry level? Because this program is, it's designed to prepare people for entry level, get the foot in the door. And the answer was clearly Network Plus and Security Plus. So that's what we're focused on. We certainly intend to add additional certification as time goes on, but we really want to be pretty laser focused. As I mentioned, only 30% of us are in the workforce, and young people, especially under the age of 23, are underrepresented in the workforce. So we're pretty focused on getting people started. As far as technology skills, we say that if you can navigate effectively and efficiently around a website, you can use a search engine. Those are the basic skills that you really need to take the training and the certifications and start the entry level work. There are personal characteristics around attention to detail and curiosity and those types of things. And this program was started and designed by a gentleman, a Nova Coast employee named David Main. And David has a very interesting story. He was severely injured in an automobile accident. He's a double amputee and lost an eye and a lot of mobility in his hands. And he was on a disability check for 8 years, a small government check. And he, one of his sons enrolled in community college. David enrolled. He somehow was in a cybersecurity class and discovered the world and the industry and progressed and got a degree. And he became a SOC manager and a hiring manager. So he's hired many of hundreds of people into the cybersecurity industry. So for those people with disabilities who are interested, if they fill out the form at theapexprogram.com, they're going to get an interview with David, who will help them determine whether or not this is a path they would like to pursue or not.
Great advice. How would you encourage people with limited sight or disabilities to get into cyber? You talked about some of the programs, but I'm guessing that from what it sounds like you're talking about, there is a point where they may not yet believe all that they're capable of yet.
Right.
Is that right?
Yes.
So how do you get them from point A to point B?
I am such a believer in the informational interview. I didn't know any blind people when I was growing up, so I didn't have any successful blind adult role models. I really was in that category of needing career exploration. My parents were teachers. Everyone we knew were teachers, so I had no concept of the business world. So as I mentioned, the National Federation of the Blind and the American Council of the Blind, NFB.org, acb.org, to contact a local chapter, get connected with some blind adults who are successfully employed. Any occupation you can think of, there's a blind person doing it. I was told as a senior in high school I couldn't take chemistry because it was too dangerous, and I didn't take chemistry. But now I've met blind people with PhDs in chemistry, people who started their own businesses and sold them for multi-millions of dollars as chemists, blind people who teach chemistry at the university level. So you can contact me directly. I'd happily give you some guidance, but I think connecting with people who've done it, who are in the IT industry as blind people, who are acting efficiently, effectively in the cybersecurity environment as blind people, that we're out here.
What would you say to industry or employers who are looking at employing entry level, but they're not yet sure if this is something that would work for them? How do you convince them that this is something that they could do?
Well, I think the first thing is back what I said, connect with the structures and resources that are available to help them. The vocational rehabilitation agency in their state, community-based nonprofits in their community, other employers who have already taken some of these steps, the community-based organizations. So really exposure and demonstration. I've taken clients on field trips to the Walgreens Distribution Center in Anderson, South Carolina, and had them transformed after a day, looking at a workforce where 40% of the people have disabilities, and the culture is of active mutual support, caring. So I think proof is in the pudding. Going to see it, talking to people who are doing it.
This is great advice. Thank you so much for talking to us today, taking time. You provided so many amazing resources that I think are very useful. We can take those back. We can look at our communities and see how we can get involved. So definitely appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, wonderful to be here. And, you know, I'd love to talk with anyone who is working on being more inclusive of underrepresented populations in the cybersecurity industry, talk about how I can be helpful in expanding that thinking to people with disabilities.
Absolutely. There may be more questions coming in through the chat, but I believe that we have provided some additional resources in the chat if you are interested in finding out more. And I believe that you had just provided contacts as well.
Yep, I'm here.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rocco. Thanks, everyone.
And now on to our next speaker. Sanford Weinberg has been working for over 20 years in the cybersecurity field and is recognized as a leading expert in the field. He has been an adjunct professor for multiple universities over 15 years, and he speaks at numerous events all over the country. He is involved with the Ohio National Guard Cyber Reserve, both in activations and their education subgroup, as well as assisting with the Marine Corps Cyber Auxiliary. Mr. Weinberg, thank you so much for joining us today. We are excited to hear about your presentation on Privacy Evolved, How to Teach, Train, and Thrive Amid Regulation Changes.
Thank you so much for your great introduction. Let me pin me. Can you pin my?
You're in the main part of the screen, Sanford, please.
Oh,
just
yeah. Great. Thank you. 691. This is the number of cybersecurity, privacy, AI legislation that was introduced from 2020 to 2024. Now, looking at that number, type into the Q&A if you are one of the people involved in either planning, implementing those requirements. What is like one word that you would tell us that how that number makes you feel? Go ahead and put it in. This is an interactive session.
So people type it in, let's see, we have one remark who says, very uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable, overwhelmed. Yeah, exactly. So let's see how that number breaks down.
Overwhelming, bewildered. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you all for contributing. Another overwhelming.
So, in the federal scheme, we have 215 in the state, privacy and cybersecurity, 290. Federal AI bills proposed, 112, and state AI bills proposed is 74 in 5 years. So now, does that make you feel any different? Any better? Yeah, probably not. Doesn't for me either. Like, in addition, if you wait until the legislation passes, you're too late, right? You've got a lot less work, but you also have a lot less time to do it. And from somebody who's been involved in that for decades, you usually don't have enough time even at the beginning. So now they, as well as they might revise the law, right? And then you have to start over, and then another regulatory body is going to enact something similar. So how do we start helping people involved and stop them from being overwhelmed? 2 steps. Oops. One, get to know their pain, right? We need to understand who we are helping. Do they have to sift through requirements? Do they have to code it? Do they have to market it? Or do they have to take care of the infrastructure to manage it? We're going to lessen their pain by breaking it down into smaller sections, giving them clear strategies, right? I've been a technical manager on huge and complex projects, and often people were overwhelmed just because they didn't even know where to begin. I'm sure in your life you have had either situations like that or know people that did. My job was to help break it down into chunks and, that they could then manage, right? There's a famous riddle that you might know. It is one of my favorites. How do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So how do we make it less overwhelming and less stressful? Put some of those ideas into the Q&A. That's great. Yeah, we're help simplify it, help break it down, right? One bite at a time. Exactly. So first, make it easier to analyze the laws, right? You've got 691. And how can we simplify it to bring it down? Simplify what needs to be implemented, right? Including analyzing the laws, what needs to be implemented. And then the third is to reduce the amount of work to implement. So how do you do this, right? Start with questions. So go ahead and put into the Q&A your role in dealing with the legislative landscape. I know some of you are educators, some of you are involved directly, that we've got a broad grouping in the audience today. A lot of educators, implementer, coder. Yeah. So now that we know who are the audiences and I've identified their pain, the next step is with the hundreds of laws that we have to deal with in some form or another. and start to simplify. So we ask questions like, what might it take to implement those requirements? Or who would be involved in implementing those changes, right? Job titles or departments or other groups, depending on what type of organization you're dealing with. What might the time frame be to implement these new requirements? Both what's needed and, of course, what the regulation says, right? Since most of us are in the federal space, right? We're dealing with CMMC, and you know, the deadlines are moving right forward, and it's going to be interesting over the next year to see how many contracts require CMMC and how many contractors are certified to comply. We'll see. It's going to be be very interesting. And if you're involved in implementing those requirements, how might you feel about trying to keep up with those numbers of new laws and what's needed? So if I were to ask you how to break down those hundreds of laws into categories of laws, how do you start, right? Maybe put an answer or two into the Q&A box. Privacy, identity. I see children's rights, individual rights. Great. That's a great start. So very similar to you, this is how I break it down. I call it the legislative dirty dozen. So similar to a lot of the things that you guys put in, right? Consumer data rights, tracking, protections. That's, you know, everything from cookies to where you've been to aggregating data, the biometric regulations, data breach notification. That's also changing drastically. If you looked at the Health and Human Services proposal for HIPAA, they have a very tight time frame for data breach notification requirements of 72 hours, right? That's kind of scary, because as someone who's actively works on these things, you often don't know what the depth is in 72 hours, right? There are a couple of townships near me that were breached not too long ago. And I was listening to, I happen to not be in one of the investigations. I almost was involved as part of the Cyber Reserve, but I wasn't. So I am only disclosing things that the public knows, but I was watching the news very carefully. And I was talking to some people in the education space and in K through 12 schools, and they were very upset at how, from their point of view, it took a long time for the city to give notification. But they actually were pretty good from my point of view, because it takes time. So yeah, it's hard, you know. Children's privacy, cross-border transfers, where are you keeping data? Where are you transferring data? What does it have to go through? And some of those get pretty tricky with, not to pick on them, but something like Grammarly, right? If you think about it, everything you type goes up to the cloud, and then comes back after it gets checked. So they have a copy of every letter that you type, and as well as it's transversing the thing. And I think they're a great company. I've heard no types of breaches, no issues. So don't take this wrong, but it's scary from a security point of view, and regulations might force you not to be able to have it, right? Sensitive personal data protection. We have it keeps changing, right? What was PII yesterday, or what wasn't PII yesterday, is now PII. That's oops. That's pretty scary. The laws that say, oh, I need to that even a name or an address by itself, in some cases are considered, in some locales are considered PII, which I think is a little ridiculous, because that's public information. But even if it is, it's, those regulations are calling it PII. So we got to be careful, right? So yeah, so these are my 12 dirty dozen that the laws hit. But if you want, we can even break it down into a simpler form. Do you remember in elementary school when in math you learned how to simplify equations, and you kept doing that until you had a much simpler form? It's kind of like that, right? Unless you hated math and me even mentioning it brings you up nightmares, in which case just completely forget what I said. Okay, so I break it down further into 5 pieces, right? Identity and permissions, your sensitive personal information, data leakage. You know, all of these pieces are subsets, and maybe this is too simple. Maybe you go back to the dirty dozen, but now that we have our different categories, or categories of different ones, how does that help us, right? Imagine for a second that if we didn't have to deal with hundreds of laws, but instead deal with only a few. And in fact, I'm going to bring up another math analogy. So if you're one of those people who freaks out again about math, put your fingers in your ears for the next 3 seconds, right? Do all of you remember lowest common denominators, where you bring it down to something that is simpler but still equivalent to all the levels or all the things above it, right? Or like spiciest dish standard, right? Where a chef will season the food until, you know, based on to match the person with the lowest tolerance for spice, right? So we're going to do that for each of the security laws. We take a look at each of those categories, and we take the most restrictive law and use that as our baseline. And then we can also use, you know, and any law that's less restrictive is automatically covered. And then we can compare things against, for any new legislation, compare it against that baseline. And if it's less restrictive, then we can forget about it and mark that as done. And if it's more restrictive, then we code to that and we replace that as our baseline, right? So here's an example. So here's my chart of on the left hand, or on the left hand side, it's that dirty dozen that we showed in a previous slide. And then I have this chart that says, the most restrictive from the United States, both, first state, then federal, and most restrictive internationally. So, if we, so like Consumer Data Rights and Protection, so CPRA, the California Privacy Act, the American Privacy Act on the federal law, and the GDPR, which is the bane of a lot of people's existence. Same with California. So you see California popping up a bunch of times in the most restrictive. You see GDPR all over the place, right? Because in the general world, those are the most comprehensive, the ones that are the deepest, the strictest in terms of cybersecurity and privacy and AI overall. So, because every thing these days has to have an AI component, you can slay the dragon with, to help you do this by using AI, right? You can use it to summarize the new regulatory issues. You can, so, it's great at pulling out the requirements and especially fine-tuning those AI prompts, right? What's pending? There are some great sites as well. Congress has a great site. There are sites for the states changes, including maps and other things. You can use it for compliance comparisons, right? How does this legislation differ from your baseline, right? How do you determine the gaps that you have, or the gaps in the things that one law covers and one law doesn't mention, right? Because we all know new technology, new laws. Brief notification requirements, right? You can ask for specifics. What are my breach notification? What are I mentioned the HIPAA changes that HHS wants. They want to have you back up and running in 72 hours. And again, I look at that and I'm like, a lot of healthcare organizations are not going to be able to do that. It takes time, no matter how sophisticated you are. So again, it'll be interesting how that changes. Automated contract review, privacy impacts, right? Data localization, where are you allowed to keep your data? A lot of requirements say it has to stay in the US. So how do you travel? How do you make sure that it doesn't travel out? Using the gov system, FedRAMP or gov systems, or what happens if somebody travels? Are they allowed to take equipment? How do you make sure that data doesn't move from the US? Because sometimes those penalties or fines are expensive, right? And we've got to make sure that we're doing the best we can to protect the data that we have. Regulatory changes or updates, right? California did an update a couple of years ago that revised their already strict system. Yeah, don't need to say anymore, right? There have been updates to GDPR that have made it stricter. PCI gets changed every few years, right? Even though it's not technically a regulatory piece, but if you want to take credit cards, right? you can use it to look at the state versus federal differences, because you don't have to code this twice. You don't have to worry about states if you're doing this most restrictive model. The overlap, right? I mentioned CMMC, but we have, and HIPAA before, but we have other frameworks and legal requirements. So how does that compare to the current, the new proposed law, right? So we try it, if you can use AI to help you analyze these things. Of course, I do have the two disclaimers, right? Verify it, and this is, consult real legal counsel. I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV. You need to make sure that what the AI is feeding you is correct, but it can really help, right? So let's open it up for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for your insightful presentation on how to break down the regulations so it's less overwhelming. Let's see our first couple of questions. The first one will be, will other federal agencies utilize DoD's CMMC assessment methodology, or will each agency stipulate its own assessment technology?
So I don't know what's going on with my camera. It's less than happy. Hold on 1 second. Maybe no, that didn't help. Okay. Technology, right? Wish I had someone who knew technology here. I think, anyone who's gone through a CMMC audit, or have dealt with the 110 controls, it's quite intense, and it's based on NIST's 800 117. So I think a lot of organizations will use it. Whether they'll be as strict as DoD, I have no idea. In terms of that, you have to get 110 as a perfect score in order to be level 2 certified. But having gone through that exercise, I think it's very comprehensive, and it's even though most organizations that go through it, even no matter how much preparation, will learn things along the way about additional gaps or additional things. So it's a good idea, even if it isn't a requirement, right? So
there are a lot of quick reactions that happen. We talked a lot about the regulations that are overwhelming, and so many of them, and the speed at which we're working to implement them. Can you talk a little bit about the quickness to react versus the taking your time to actually understand? You were talking about how to field which ones are most important, but I think that comes down to really understanding the essence of what is being asked in the regulation. Can you talk a little bit more about the quickness to react versus the taking your time to understand it?
So again, I mentioned earlier that I have at times been a technical project manager. I was for many years before actually switching back into a technical role. But so if you don't understand it really well, then you're not going to be able to implement it and safeguard it. So you got to take your time to do it. Security and these regulations are an ever-changing process. So you have to take your time and understand it and compare it and look for those little nuances that could mess you up, right? That that could cause you to fail an audit, or to fail, or to be to violate one of these regulations. So I think you got to take your time and understand it and get help. It can't be one person who's doing it all. And just, be careful, right? And do it as fast as you can, but break it down. And that's why I suggest this most restrictive model, because then you're saving yourself a lot of work and a lot of craziness of trying to look at every single proposed or enacted law.
You were talking a lot about the speed at which some of these new regulations come out and just trying to catch up with them. Sometimes it feels like a gotcha, right? So how do you make sure that you're complying with the latest at the same time, like you're trying to catch up to the last regulation? There's already a new one out there. How do you make sure that you are keeping pace?
Like I said, there are a few websites, between Congress and there's a state one that shows what's pending, and that's why I look at what's pending, right? What's proposed, because I want to be ahead of that curve. And then I watch to see when it's likely to be passed, and I keep an eye on that. A lot of these take a long time and get revised along the way. But you have that much more time if you're dealing with the proposed stuff rather than just when it's enacted.
The 691 separate bills that come with each with its own regulations and reporting requirements have effective legislation, but what are the consequences on the 691 separate perspective on what quote unquote looks good and what we should spend our time and energy on, which is compliance and not necessarily security?
Interesting question. A lot of companies, a lot of places will separate the two of compliance versus security. I don't. I view it as a piece of security. So, and as you're implementing these things, you might realize that, oh, while I'm doing this, there are some other gaps that I see in my network, in my websites, etc. So just have an open mind and don't just go for the exact letter of the law, but like look at what, as I mentioned before, the CMMC requirements are kind of eye-opening when you actually go through an audit from your neighborhood C3PAO. And it's a security focus, right? So as you look at these things, you're looking them through a certain lens, and it's going to help you have a better posture.
Is it true that the information in many cases is routed through the cheapest route? For example, Iran, China, Russia?
I'm not. Oh, I assume, and maybe the person who asked can add to the chat. I assume that you're saying that if I'm running data across somewhere, it's going to go, you're going to pick lines and other things that are cheaper rather than a more expensive route that might be safer. I think when you get to this level of security, you're not going the cheapest route, right? Anybody who's dealt with the price gouging that happens in a FedRAMP space knows that we're not in it for the cheap piece. Right, all the controversy over TikTok, right? And when it was shut down, what happened? People tried to use VPNs to reroute to pretend that they weren't coming from the US, and they still couldn't get in because they were still being marked as Americans. And then if you read their terms of their terms of agreement, it says we're going to track you by your SIM card, your GPS, your IP, and other things. Like, it spells it out there. They're honest about it. And so they proved the point of why there's controversy, right? So I don't know that cheap is the I think you have to be worried about your data and protecting your data, and sensitive that if this data gets out, right, is it going to cause damage? I think that's what really it comes down to.
Can you tell us at all anything about the NIST cybersecurity framework? If it'll be implemented, passed in Congress, what we should look forward to?
In addition to not being a lawyer, I'm not a politician, nor do I play one on TV. I think that some of our hosts might be better at answering that than I would be. Yeah.
Similar question, but this one applies to FedRAMP requirements and whether or not they should be adhered to.
Well, if you're dealing with the federal government, you have to adhere to them, just like CMMC if you're a government contractor, right? Unless, if you, depending on your requirements, as I understand it, and again, consult legal counsel for anything that I say, because I've been wrong before and I will be wrong again. But if you host it internally, then you don't have to, to deal with it being FedRAMP approved. If you host things or use a service that's in the cloud, you do. That's my understanding. Again, I'm not an expert, but so if you don't want to deal with it, and it is a pain, and you usually have to be a version or two behind, and some products that you'd love to use that are in the commercial space are, FedRAMP takes way too long, in my opinion. Maybe some of these new requirements of CMMC and other things that generally uplift it will help that process. But I think the process needs to be revamped, but I don't think you can not adhere to it if you're in that space.
Any thoughts on website mashups? Should they be better regulated?
Again, we're working on protecting data and protecting people. And there's a lot of confusion around requirements as it is. And there are a lot of times when we give away our information and then get upset that companies have it, right? You look at Facebook or Twitter or any of these social media things, or loyalty programs at your local supermarket, and you're giving information away, right? You are not you're not a paying customer. You have no rights whatsoever to that, to what you put on there, or regulating it. You're the commodity. They're selling it to get advertisers and do whatever they need to do. And again, they explicitly tell you in all the user agreements that you don't read. Zoom, right? We're on Zoom Gov, but regular Zoom says, came out a year and a half ago and said, anything that you say on Zoom or put in chat or do whatever, we have the non-exclusive right to use it. I was appalled. I wrote an article on it, but nobody seems to care. So, if we need security and we need to protect data and people. So anything along those lines, but again, don't forget all the data that you give away. Bose, right? Bose got in trouble a few years ago, probably 10 years ago now. They didn't put something in their user agreement, but they were taking their headphones and the app that used to control the headphones, right? You don't think of agreements, was monitoring everything that you played through the headphones. So they could tailor different languages or different themes of stuff that you like. So, it's a privacy concern, right? If they target things, right? We've had breaches where there have been patterns of things that have been targeted, by ethnic groups or by wealth classes or by other, minority or disability things, right? That's not okay. So, yeah, that's.
Thank you so much for your time today, and a lot of very interesting conversations, interesting topic. At this point, we're going to take a 5-minute break. We will see everyone back at around 2:55. So look forward to seeing you then. Thank you again.
One quick thing, feel
Yeah.
free to reach out and connect with me if you want any of the charts or, I'm on LinkedIn. Yeah, I am happy to talk to anyone.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right, everyone. Enjoy your break. We'll resume in around 5 minutes. All right. So welcome back, everyone. Let me turn my camera on so you can see me. So welcome back. I am your host and FISSEA co-chair, Frauke Steinmeier. We had some great presentations so far, and we have a few more left to go. So at this point, I am going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. We've got Ryan Leervik, who has nearly 2 decades of experience in offensive and defensive cyber operations, computer security, and executive communications. His expertise ranges from discovering technical exploits to preparing appropriate information security strategies to defend against them. Ryan is also the author of Understand, Manage, and Measure Cyber Risk. Mr. Leervik, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to your presentation on board-level reporting.
Great. Thank you very much, Frauke. And thanks for everybody for being here. I guess, so broadly, for background purposes, it's probably important to think through. So I've spent about 10 years in public service and then a little bit longer in private. And there's always a struggle between what do we report and what we don't report, and what makes most sense for understanding from an executive programmatic standpoint, largely based in risk. So what I'd like to walk through today is just kind of give you kind of a sense of what's been working in the private sector, but also what's helping explain sort of our problem that we're constantly trying to solve for in even in the public space, right? So I'm going to kind of go through some of the publications that we've sort of tied together to create a thread in order to help solve that problem. So that's sort of the context for today. So what this is not is specifically, specific board reporting that's working extremely well. What this is a broad brush of what we're seeing work from an understanding of the risk and communicating the risk standpoint. So I just want to sort of set that up front so everybody is clear. So thanks for joining in. The Q&A is open. So as questions come in, we'll answer them. But if we could, let's jump to the first slide, please. All right, so for context here, broadly, what's happening is, at the executive level, sometimes we struggle with what is and what is not working from a cyber awareness purpose, which leads into training, but also broad programmatic awareness. So there's sort of three issues here, right? One is executives don't always have the context to know what questions to ask, right? So as practitioners, we can think through, we kind of inherently know sort of where the issues are, where the impact to the organization could be, which in executive parlance is risk. And, what we want to be able to do in order to handle it, mitigate it, or address it in some fashion, right? But the challenge is executives don't always have that context, largely either, not having the technical background or the understanding of why it matters. So the challenge then becomes in communicating the strength or weakness of our programs, right? Just from a risk awareness side becomes extremely challenging because of these varying degrees of understanding, right? It helps the parlance and the vernacular that we use sort of can get lost if we rely on our knowledge without being able to translate it in some way. So what I want to share with you today is an approach that's been working that literally becomes a simplified message, leveraging a lot of some of the core components of current guidance from NIST in sort of executive consumable ways, if that makes sense, right? So I'll get to that last. So quickly, if we could get the next slide, please. Great. So here's the problem with number one that we're seeing. The risk is not always well defined, right? Which leads to a bit of confusion. And what I mean by confusion, what we see a lot from executive and from board reporting is you inbound a lot of questions that categorically could be covered, but without the understanding, right? Seems like sort of a soup of really good questions. They just don't have a bucket to get placed into, right? From a cyber risk standpoint. So, we see here, three questions that we see quite a bit. Hey, what's the risk of, play ransomware group, or let's just pick a small one, right? Or X ransomware group, or what's the risk of a vulnerability that was just released with a critical CVSS score, right? Or what's the risk of a new phishing campaign, right? Targeting companies like ours. Well, the challenge is, right, you don't have that much time to get to the point and to be able to address what the risk is and understand how it's being managed. And so what we find is a lot of the questions that are being asked don't have a rubric to sort of fall into, right? Because we know from guidance and sort of being as practitioners that threats and vulnerabilities in likelihood, it doesn't equal risk, right? It's the impact to the organization. We know this from a lot of the publications that we read and also what's come out from NIST. So what we've found works here is, if you could jump to the next slide, please, is literally pulling from the NIST IR 7621 R1 and breaking this down into categorical, mutually exclusive definitions of risk. And what I mean by that is to some of us, this might be wildly obvious. To others, maybe not so much, right? It might be implied versus written. And what we're seeing is being able to explain this in a clear policy somewhere, that this is how we're viewing risk. This is just one example, right? Pulling from the 7621 R1 to say, look, okay, great. Let's put this in context where it takes a threat and an open vulnerability on, critical asset, right? To have impact of the organization. And that's our risk. And what we do here by categorically, making these sort of mutually exclusive, it has the beauty, right, of educating the board and executives on what exactly the risk is, right? So let's take some of the examples that we just saw, right? So X ransomware group, right? Okay, great. That's a threat, right? They're looking for specific vulnerabilities. If you follow their TTPs, right? They're looking for specific vulnerabilities that, if vulnerable on assets that connect to our corporate networks, right, could lock up our organization with, based on the particular ransomware, and then you're in the decision of do we not pay? But the question really becomes, do you have the vulnerability? Right. So helping to explain things in that way, we found has been extremely helpful, because then of the myriad, what feels like, plethora of groups, targeted groups out there, threats, let's say, right, that have varying targets, we only have a small portion of those. You get to whittle down sort of that myriad group into a digestible subset, right, that relate to the networks in which or the targets in which they're specifically targeting, which are the vulnerabilities, right, on certain corporate assets, right, applications, networks, even users, right, and so, or devices or otherwise. And so what happens is you start to home in on, what we found is we start to home in on the problem a lot easier, because the risk becomes a little bit more understood, which gets us into the conversation that we really want to have, which is how are we deploying our resources, right? People, time, and money in places that really address the risk, rather than chasing down questions that may or may not be relevant to the business or to the organization, right? Or to the operations of, of the entity, for that matter, right? Even a government entity. And so I wanted to share this with you because this has worked really well in the private sector. We've had some success as well in government entities. But before we get into sort of, all of the guidance and the pieces that we're trying to deploy or meet in our organizations, having a well-defined definition of risk, right, in policy, that fits in standards and procedures and others, is extremely helpful in starting our programmatics of, okay, great, how well are we doing the program? So I wanted to share this piece with you because we've had a lot of success solving this particular problem broadly in the corporate space. So what this sort of understood, if we can go to the next slide, please. So what we're seeing is, okay, what the impact isn't always well understood, right? So not only is the risk not understood, now the impact isn't always understood. And this leads to this big disconnect between the categories and costs. Now, the IR 7621 and other NIST guidance has been very clear not to say, let's put a dollar amount to this, right? There are others out there that we've seen, FAIR and others that have been doing this for a while. The challenge is, what we found is we can get to a rating, right, that aligns to a broad dollar amount. We'll get to this in a second, that at least gives them an understanding, right, of about what the impact is, which then helps frame the question. And what makes sense, in this is where the difference between obviously government and private sector sits, largely because one is revenue generating. Well, government's revenue generating, but that's just the IRS and some Treasury. But the issue then becomes, all right, well, what is going to be the cost we're going to have to pay that's going to cut down on our profitability, if you will, right? Whereas in the government sector, it's, okay, what are the actual costs, the fines, the fees, the penalties, and the regulatory pieces that we might have to pay, or push into some other category, depending on the government entity, right, of where that cost is going to sit. At the end of the day, it's going to come down to this, but it's a different lens in the private sector than it is in government. We all know this. But what happens here is that having a definition then keeps these type of questions, gives these type of questions context. We see a lot like, hey, what's the impact in the organization? Sometimes we need an answer, right? How does this actually relate to us, right? Can you explain the impact categories again? So what winds up happening is, without a true understanding of the definition or the damage to the systems, we don't really get a sense of the actual cost, right? So that problem, if you go to the next slide, please, we've seen solved with, again, the NIST IR 7621 has categorical categories for definitions of where you can assign either dollars and cents or the risk categories. And what's interesting is we're finding this really, quite frankly, like resonate really well with executives because they can understand, all right, damage to information systems, great, what's the cost, right? Or what's the impact level, right? Regulatory fines and penalties. We see this a lot because we're following what's coming out with the SEC or what's been coming out with the FCC, not at the federal level, but at the state level. We see things like the New York Department of Financial Services. Banks are really concerned about this, right? And the fines and penalties that could be imposed on the organizations depending on the violation, if you will, right? Of course, there's decreased productivity. There could be a cost. This is the lost work or lost access, right? Loss of information, of course. Now you're talking more fines and penalties depending on the type of information, if it's protected, right? But the major key here is the loss of business income relative to legal fees, incident response costs. Now, what's interesting is in the private sector, what we're seeing a lot of is like these are immediate costs that hurt the overall whole, right? And so we're finding, we're having a lot of success in this particular area, just having the conversation in mutually exclusive categories, thanks to 7621, in a way that helps us understand, what the loss magnitude could be. So it's winding up to be pretty helpful. And so what's interesting, just to kind of take it a step further, and I'm going to check here for questions. To take it a step further, with these two pieces sort of baselined, we've now found we can get sort of the executive level thinking in a place where we can start with the programmatic risks and have a conversation around that, simply because the impact becomes understood relatively, right, to other impact. And we've got definitions so that when they see certain threats or vulnerabilities, they've got context to it. And now we can start focusing on the most critical areas, which is, if we can go to 3, please. The next slide, please. Right. We can start getting into some sort of qualitative metrics, right, to craft a compelling board-ready story. So what we've seen here, if you're following so far, is we're seeing a lot of reliance on the NIST CSF here for categorical, almost mutually exclusive categories of where the risk really sits in the enterprise. And not a full deployment, say, of the NIST CSF. That actually came up in one of the questions before. But really sort of an overarching, the way it was sort of designed, sort of top down, like, hey, here's some categories, align your program to it, map to it. And now we have mutually exclusive categories where we can start to put things as they come up in place and assign qualitative risk measures. Lauren asked a question. So when speaking to C-suite or executive stakeholders, should you address the potential, if not but when, business monetary impacts before bringing up the potential risk? It's a great question. I'm going to try to be as straightforward as possible on this. There's a split in the business community, in the cybersecurity community, no matter where you sit, in either business or in government, of the potential, if not but when. That's the likelihood. If we go, we don't have to do this front, but if you go back to the definition of risk, likelihood is a piece. And I want to address this because it's very important, and we're kind of, a lot of us are practitioners here. In the community, I have found a clear split. I mean, literally, it feels like 50-50. I don't have empirical data on this, but it feels like a split between likelihood or not. Because, Lauren, to your question, it's like, if not but when, well, that puts in the category, eventually it's 100%, right? Or others are like, well, the likelihood is somewhere between, 0 and 100% if we're using percentage terms. I always think of it like this, right? Like some sort of a 9/11, government joinee, right? And actually, quite frankly, my office was at the Pentagon was right at where the left-hand side of the wing came in. I wasn't there at the time, but 2 years after. And I always look at this and say, okay, well, what was the thinking of, terrorists hijacking airplanes and using them as weapons, right? And the thinking at the time was, nah, never happened. We have all these controls in place. We know what happened. So on one side, we have people that say likelihood, if there's a chance, just assume it's 100% chance. And then you have a priori, right, against other data you can prioritize what you actually think the risk could be based specifically on impact. So Lauren, I think that gets to the essence of your question. There is a whole group out there, largely in the financial and industry and insurance industry, that loves the likelihood piece because of all the consumable variables that can go into the calculus for risk. And so in that community, right, which largely sort of moves towards the FAIR model, you start to see that likelihood is a huge component because it may or may not happen. Now, that's largely in the actuarial world. Now, let's say it started in the actuarial world and it's moved its way out, but it's such a big piece of their calculus that it does matter. And that's where the split is. So quite frankly, likelihood is it's an executive decision on whether or not they want to see likelihood. So that's what I've seen work there. And it's really interesting because it really has a big impact on how you prioritize what the big risks are. Because with that sort of likelihood weight, you could downplay a huge risk and not see it. Kelly asked a quick question. Can I get the recording? Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, over. So yes, I think so. I'll let Franca answer that. So here's what we're seeing here. So now that we get the executive and C-level in this sort of headspace, now we can start talking about programmatic, measures that speak to the risk, right? We're not in this particular discussion, we're not going to go through KPIs, KRIs, OKRs, programmatic lists and a lot of the NIST measures that are published out there for specific controls. Those are great for programmatic ones, and those work really well. The question here is, what can we get digestible to an executive? Here's what we've seen here. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I'll get to the questions in just a second. So what we see here is to bring up the CSF again, right? 2.0, obviously. We start to pull out the functions as a category, a quick description to remind whoever's consuming the information about what the intent is, right? So, and then the proposed activities that they may or may not want to address, in a simple measure that speaks to the intent of it. So there's a one-to-one relationship between the function, the description, so the intent, right? An activity and a measure to this, which speaks to the intent of the function or the activity underneath it. And why that's important is because now when we get to like real empirical data, we're going to need that math and that goal to understand it as we look to our programs for the data. Right? One of the biggest challenges we see almost everywhere is a function of, we have a bunch of the data, but we don't exactly know what to make sense of it. What I've seen at the executive level is we flip that and think top down. We then see, all right, here's the goal. So for example, governance, right? We need to understand that our risk management strategy and expectations are aligned inside the organization, right? Let's just simplify it in those terms. Forgive me, I realize what I'm saying now, but just to keep it simple for explanation purposes, then we can pull and say, all right, well, how many, right, of our cybersecurity initiatives are on time? We can start to put measures in place that actually start to answer that question in a way that determines where the risk is. The one that I like the best, right? Oh, thanks, Lauren. Great comment. Is an identify, right? Back to the classic 1.0 and 1.1, right? We can, with the understanding of risk, we really start to get to the asset management discussion, which is where our risk is. Like when we really sit back and we can get the executive in a place where they can think, we can say, look, the risk is really in two places. One is that threat takes a vulnerability on a critical asset. We need to know where our critical assets are, right? As practitioners, we know this, but as executives, they may not be thinking that, right? It's a lot more interesting to chase, and understand a threat or a ransomware group than it is to say, not important, but what is important are all of our IT assets aren't really understood. In fact, our cloud instances, our SOC can't even see it because we don't have visibility of it in a CASB, and we certainly don't have it connected to the SOC, or the SOC doesn't have visibility of it. Problem. Yeah. And this is where I like we've seen the connection between like percentage of critical assets reviewed for criticality, the first one here, and identify, that lines up with an asset management program, that lines up with identify. We can now have a conversation around the real risk, which is, do we know all of our critical assets? Wow, sounds boring. Yeah, well, everything we do from this point on may be a challenge if we don't have visibility of everything. Because we may have the greatest controls on 60% of our assets. That's not where the attacker is going to go. The attacker is going to see that. They're going to go on the 40% that doesn't. And then they're going to escalate privileges to get there, which is why the next measure that makes a lot of sense that we've seen is in protect, supporting this, access control, percentage of privileged accounts under privileged access management. What does that mean? That means we know who has access to what privileged systems, right? Or has privileged access to various systems, and we're monitoring it. Right there, if those two problems are well understood, you've got the risk at least understood in a way that can start to push real conversations around controls and behaviors and training, right? And education into where the real risk is, right? One of the problems we see all the time in training and awareness is we're focused a lot on the threat, and that matters, or the vulnerability, and that matters. But what we miss sometimes is the impact, right? Is it important? Because a lot of times as an attacker, sometimes they'll just do things to get you distracted to then go after what's important. But if our education and our training can start focusing on like, all right, hey, you have access to critical systems. Here's the impact, right? We talked about PII in the last one, right? Or, privileged information, which in our case leads to not only the loss of data, which you never get back for the individual, that's a harm, right? From a privacy standpoint. And then, equally for the organization, fines and penalties, right? So if they understand what's important and what to protect, well, now your training is a little more honed on where the problem is, right? The other one I like here, before I get to some other questions, is in detection, right? Mean time to detect. We've all heard this before from the SOC, but what's really interesting here is that's where the risk is in the organization. It's on the critical asset. But if you can't detect what an attacker is doing, then it's gone, right? You can't respond to it. If you can't respond to it, well, then we've got a bigger problem, right? Then it's already gone. But if you can take that mean time to detect and then get mean time to respond inside and close that gap just slightly, well, now immediately you're putting the time in risk mitigation activities that matter. So all this is to say, we've had a lot of success. And I would say we in the community, right, have had a lot of success having conversations at the C-suite and the executive level around these to get the thinking around where it matters so that the resources can be deployed, and employed in areas where they have the biggest impact. So that's what we've seen. Let me get to a couple questions. On slide 69, did you mean to refer to qualitative or qualitative measures? Instead, you refer to quantitative. Great. So really from the executive level, qualitative makes sense. So if we go to the next slide, this will make a lot of sense. On slide 70, all of your sample measures are quantitative. Yes, completely. And I don't mean to interchange those, and they're certainly not synonymous, but in briefing, there is a mix between qualitative, like are we about somewhere, or true quant, where we have real measures that we can put a metric to specifically come to an outcome. The distinction between the two, and I maybe didn't make that clear, so thanks for bringing it out, Jonathan, is understanding, does it speak to the risk? Overall, what we've seen work really well from a risk standpoint is it risk informative? Is it actionable, and can we measure it over time? In that case, quantitative data may not be that helpful, like number of DDoS attacks, not helpful, but number of DDoS attacks that shut down our corporate network, important, because then we know what's actionable. Well, we need better load balancers. Okay, great. How much are those? And you see the conversation. So it's measurable, it's actionable over time. Or qualitative measures, somewhere along the lines of, the reality is like percentage of assets reviewed for criticality is unintuitively qualifiable, because we never actually know, right, at any given time what our real asset inventory is in large organizations. But the issue is we're trying to get there. So hopefully that answers the question, Jonathan. All right, I see some of them disappearing, so hopefully that's all right. So here's where we are from the reporting standpoint. We got about 5 minutes left, so I'm gonna open up the questions here in just a minute. is once we can put these up, we can set a goal, talk about where we currently are and show the trend. And now we've got the risk conversation understood, and we have yet to use one cyber term so far. And we've seen this broadly in the community working at various levels. So I think that's about, I'm going to be out of time here in just a minute or two. So just want to open up for questions, but this is what we're seeing, largely borrowing what's published now. So, maybe there's an opportunity for training and awareness and education on board level reporting on these are the simple terms to think through, and depending on where you are, we can lead into other NIST publications from there. So that's what we've been seeing. So thanks for listening.
All right. So thank you so much, Mr. Lerovic. You had a great presentation on board level reporting. This is maybe not something that everybody gets the opportunity to do, but is definitely interesting and something that maybe should be taught a little bit more. So I know that you answered a lot of questions as we were going through. We'll give it a minute to see if any more questions come in. And as a reminder to our attendees, please type your questions into the chat at the bottom right hand of your screen. We'll see if anything comes in.
Great. As we're waiting for that, I want to sort of tease out something you mentioned, which is really important. We sometimes have the assumption that because you're an executive in either executive service or in the private sector or at C-level, we know what questions to ask. And what's interesting is without the context in cybersecurity, a lot of times very smart people, they just don't know the questions to ask because it's exposure. So sometimes we can all do ourselves a favor, I've learned, by just saying, okay, when we say cyber risk, this is what we mean. And now they fill in the gaps. And when we say risk management program, these are the categories in which we need to have risk management. We need to know what we own, make sure it's protected, right? Detect anything that goes wrong, respond appropriately, and recover if it all goes poorly. And what's interesting is those terms really seem to resonate. So Franca, to your point, we don't always get the opportunity, but sometimes it's helpful to educate,
Sure.
education as you're reporting. So there you go.
I think it plays into the fact that when you're in management, you see one thing. You may have an overview of many different programs, but when you're not in management, you're working on your very singular project, and that has so many facets, and every part of it is important, but maybe not to the manager. And sometimes it's hard to see in both directions, and middle management in particular has that very unique position where they can see both up and down. Do you have any perspective on that, or is this all just specifically for management, or maybe tips for people who want to break into that role?
Great, good question. So 2 points. One, this sort of gets to Jonathan's question, right? Qualitative versus quantitative. What's interesting, if we do the right quantitative measure, we can push it all the way through the organization and have the one measure work across executive to management, to middle management, to operator, to engineer, right? So that's having that through line is what matters the most. In terms of the flip, what I've seen, so Franca, to your second question, or the second part to the question, is what's interesting, the problem here is the classic management tech divide, right? Managers tend to think in conceptual points of view, right? Can we see over the horizon? Can I see us getting there? And this is where the qualitative piece, are we about right? I don't need the specifics, but are we within a certain range from a qualitative standpoint, right? And as engineers, we think, no, I need this specific see problem, fix problem, right? And that's where the problem is. So if you can cross that chasm and get into, I understand the point and the intent of the strategy, which then gets into a policy, which is a standard procedure, and can speak from an engineering or management standpoint to that, then I've found that having that skill set will help you in the management and executive side as much as it does the technical side, right? The engineering side. So that awareness that exists sometimes really helps solve a lot of the problems. Hopefully that helps answer.
Yeah. So there's a question that came in, and I think it's a great follow-on. It's talking about the great way to tell the cyber story. What you were talking about was feeding information up to leadership, but it works both ways, right? Leadership needs to understand at least enough about the very technical work that's being done so that they don't just ignore it or say, well, that doesn't feed into what I understand the strategy to be, which could also be very detrimental. So how do you engage with senior leadership?
Terrific. Yeah, I think the answer there is the faster you can get it into specific dollars and cents for them, it's helpful. Unfortunately, the data is not coming to mind, but we can think through some of the recent attacks and say, okay, look, this particular attack has led to $1 billion in loss at this particular industry. That gets their attention very quickly. You know, we had an outage at a energy production plant that cost $5 million a minute, and they were out for 15 minutes, right? And speaking in terms of loss and impact immediately starts to get their attention. The hard part for us is then to pivot that and to speak to relative terms to the business. So in many of the, you know, think of the CrowdStrike issue. That was not a cyber attack, right? That was an update, but look at the damage, right? That type of information, you said, look, this led to Delta Airlines, $1 billion in loss, or I don't remember the data as well as I would, as well as I normally would, but that's the type of impact statements that are really helpful at the executive level, that you can tell that cyber story. Hey, we're operating here, right? This type of issue could happen that could have this type of an impact. This threat could take care of this vulnerability, right? That would have this impact on the business. This is what we're trying to avoid. And then telling the story of, you know, there's so many, honestly, so many breaches out there or issues so far. You pick one that fits. You know, Target was one of the early ones back in the day, right? That was usually the go-to example, right? Who thought of a third-party vendor that would, you know, connect to an open flat network that would then get to the point of sale system, right? And steal the credit cards low and slow, right? You didn't think about this, but what's the impact, right? Using those kind of recent examples with dollars and cents can help tell the story and help support what you're trying to accomplish.
Thank you. So that was a lot, very thorough. Thank you so much for your presentation today. We learned a lot. We now turn to our final presentation by Jim Wiggins. Mr. Wiggins is a seasoned IT and cybersecurity expert with 28 years of industry experience and a 23-year focus on information security. As the founder and CEO of FISSEA, a 501c6 nonprofit certification body accredited by the ANSI National Accreditation Board under the ISO 17024 2012, he has demonstrated an unwavering commitment to advancing federal workforce cybersecurity education. Mr. Wiggins, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to your presentation on next-gen cybersecurity education using generative AI to rapidly produce cybersecurity learning.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Fraka. Appreciate the introduction and welcome everybody. I am going to be batting cleanup here. So I am in the last spot. I hope you'll stick with me today. I hope to make today's presentation a little bit interesting. And if we could, Calvin, go to the next slide, I appreciate it. So what I want to talk to you about today is I want to talk to you about leveraging generative artificial intelligence for the primary purpose of creating cybersecurity education. I've spent the last probably year and a half to almost 2 years immersed pretty deeply in the generative AI world. And one of the things I saw really quickly for our community was the potential for using it to create content around a full range of things. So as you kind of see here, what I'm going to talk to you about is I want to talk to you a little bit about the problem space today that I see, at least in the context of cyber education in terms of its creation. Provide you a quick overview of Gen AI. If you've been, under a rock somewhere, you probably, that might be helpful, but I won't spend a lot of time on that. Also, just the role of prompting I want to just kind of provide some use cases for you that I think are pretty powerful for its use, especially when it comes to trying to educate the workforce of today and tomorrow in terms of, creating, learning objectives and slides and lab activities. And then I'm also going to talk to you about a half a dozen or so different what I call leading practices or best practices that I've basically come up with or that I've kind of run into relative to it that I think are kind of useful, just kind of guidance. But I'm going to show you some demonstrations to kind of articulate some of these ideas over the next half hour or so. And then we'll have a Q&A section, and then I do have a QR code. So some of the prompts that I'm going to show you, I do have available online. So if you want to go and fetch them, you basically can, and you can basically take a look at them. Next slide, please. All right, so this is just my background. Fraka went ahead and went over it. I've been heavily involved in cyber education. I did look through the list, and several of you I do know personally, so it's good to see that you've decided to stick around and listen to me. But some of you know who I am, or some of you know I've run into you over my professional career, worked with several of you in different contexts relative to it. But I'm heavily involved in the cyber education space. Been doing it for quite a few number of years. And so anyways, I just really hope that today's presentation is useful for you. The other thing I've been doing a lot of recently is I've been doing a lot of training in generative artificial intelligence. You'll see that I've already educated over 1,000 students in the last 1 3/4 years on its actual use. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to do quickly before we kind of delve into the kind of meat and potatoes of what I wanted to kind of leave with you or to kind of impart is this idea of, what's the problem space, right? So a lot of us have probably been involved in creating content. And one of the things that I've done over my career is run into the age-old challenges of how much time it actually takes, right? Talking to like my instructional system designers, or maybe I was creating the content myself. And we all know that, creating content is not a really easy thing to do, especially in our field where there's this rapid change of technology. And we're also oftentimes burdened by trying to be able to get subject matter experts to participate. Sometimes we don't necessarily know the role. We don't know the job very well. That's not what we do. We've got to get our SMEs to get them involved, bring them into the fold, try to get their input relative to it. That's not always an easy process. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we have available to us now, of course, is with artificial intelligence is the ability to have it generate content. And so the buzzword that got coined about 2 years ago, actually it was November of 2022 when ChatGPT was first released, so it's a little bit over 2 years old, was this idea of what's called generative artificial intelligence. And again, unless you've been under a rock, which I doubt any of us have been, generative AI is very powerful because one of the things it can do is it can help through these what called large language models create content. Basically, it can help out with all kinds of stuff. And in our particular space, that's pretty powerful because with that problem space I talked about, being able to create content is obviously one of our big challenges. The nice thing that's interesting about it is some of these models that are out there are pretty advanced. They have a lot of capability in terms of what they know about or what they can actually process relative to it. And these large language models themselves have the ability to tailor all kinds of output. Next slide, please. Now, the secret sauce relative to all of this is the prompting, right? So this is kind of a new verb that's kind of become part of our vernacular in the IT space over the last couple of years as these large language models have basically come about. And prompting is really where we ask for it to basically generate, or we ask for it to create stuff. But one of the things that we run into pretty quickly when you start to learn about large language models is that if you're not real specific with what you want, the output that it gives you in a lot of cases can be kind of all over the map. So structure plays an important role. And you also want to make sure that the prompts themselves are guiding the large language models in a meaningful way to produce content that ultimately is what you're basically looking for. We can go to the next slide if we could, Calvin. So what are the potential use cases in cyber content creation, right? Well, I'm going to talk to you about 5 specific quote unquote use cases today. Creating learning objectives, creating slide content, creating lab activities, creating case studies, and even creating quizzes. And one of the things that's really powerful is the fact that if you articulate the input, I believe, in a specific way, you'll be pretty, I think, impressed with the kind of output that you're able to have it create for you. Now, I want you to understand that the things that you have it create are not meant to be the final finished product, but they're a really good draft. And we all know that, when it comes to creating content, something that could take weeks or months to create, if we could collapse that process, that could save us a lot of time and a lot of energy and things along that nature. So one of the beyond that, relative to those 5 particular areas that I talked about, it could also help out with updating content on a more meaningful way. Next slide, if you would, Calvin. All right, so the first use case that I wanted to talk to you about is the use of learning objectives. And we know as cyber educators that when we're creating content, that's usually one of the first things we need to do. We need to kind of figure out, well, what do we want the content to do for us? So I'm going to show you a quick demo just to kind of show you illustrating the concept of using the platforms for the purpose of creating learning objectives. Now, one of the things I'm going to show you, I do have all of these available online if you're interested in playing with them at a later date. But I think the first thing I want to talk for a moment about is having some kind of structured template within which you're going to operate. A lot of people go out to these large language models and they just say, create this, create that. And that's okay, but it doesn't really narrow the scope, if you will, in terms of what you're asking for it to do. So one of the frameworks that has become somewhat mainstream in the generative AI community is something called the Ryzen framework. And I wanted just to illustrate this to you because all of the prompts I'm going to show you here over the next few minutes use this as the kind of basis for creating the content, whether it's learning objectives, whether it's slide content, whether it's case studies, whether it's quizzes, what have you. And really what it is it's broken into 5 distinct areas. Ryzen is an acronym. It stands for role, instruction, steps, end goal, and narrowing. And you can see that there are parameters on my slide that illustrate each of these. So the first thing you do is, and by the way, when you introduce this into the large language model, it's going to go through and it's going to process this in a very systematic way. So each of these is a key area that provides context, if you will, for the large language models on what you want it to do. The first is the role. You want to tell it like, well, what perspective do you want the large language model, do you want to take it on, right? Is it an instructional system designer? Is it an ISSO? Is it a risk executive? What have you? Then you provide a set of instructions. And this is where you provide it very clear, detailed instructions about what you want it to construct or create. The steps are the down and dirty. I want you to do this, then I want you to do this, then I want you to do this. The end goal provides it direction on what you expect that finished product to more or less look like. And then the last one is narrowing. And that's where you'll basically go in and you'll say, well, I want to also establish certain kind of restrictions or certain kind of parameters, constraints, if you will, that bucket or that control the output. These 5 parameter areas are very powerful in ensuring that you're guiding the large language model in terms of what you're trying to have it construct. So I can take this particular framework, which by the way, I have available. You can download this and manipulate it however you want. But then you can actually incorporate it into having it go through and then begin the process of writing, for example, learning objectives. And this is the first one I have here. So these are all just different files. The first one is, I'm just going to show you an example of how, as an ISSO course developer and curriculum designer, I want you to focus on creating targeted learning objectives for an information system security officer training program. With the instructions, I want you to develop a set of measurable and actionable learning objectives that directly reflect the key principles and practices outlined in NIST SP 137. Your objectives should capture the essential tasks, skills, and knowledge areas an ISSO must master, blah, blah, blah. So that's the instructions. Then we get into the steps. I want you to analyze 837. I want you to extract the main themes, blah, blah, blah. Define core competency areas, draft smart learning objectives, establish my end goal to produce clear and structured set of learning objectives. And then the last one is the end, where I basically have it narrow relative to it, ensure that each learning objective is directly tied. Sorry, let me get this out of the way. To a specific element of the NIST SP 137 Rev 2 and relevant to the ISSO role, keep the objectives concise, maintain a tone that's professional, blah, blah, blah. So I have now, for all intents and purposes, spent some time, and this is, the secret sauce. This is where I'm going to take this information, and now I'm going to go over to my large language model, which is ChatGPT. There is one other thing I'm going to do too, is I'm going to actually upload a copy of 837 into the large language model, so that it has the body of knowledge for all intents and purposes that I want it to basically work with. Okay, now you'll see that there's a little circle going around. Once it's completed, I'll be able to click the little arrow over here and have it actually process. Now I haven't told it anything, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to paste that particular prompt with all of those parameters into my into the input field itself. Okay, and then I'm going to basically just tell it to go ahead and send. So now what it's going to do, you'll see here in a moment, it's going to say reading documents down here. So it's reading 837 Rev 2. It's extracting all of that information, and then it's going to systematically go through that particular set of instructions that I have articulated. And now it's beginning the process of developing my learning objectives with regard to it. So you'll notice here that it's got some learning objectives around the RMF, and it's basically said, explain the purpose and key components of the risk management framework, describe the roles and responsibilities, blah, blah, blah. So you can see here that it has taken all of those instructions and created, by all accounts, a pretty comprehensive list of objectives that might be useful for me in constructing my actual course. I think that's super powerful. And I could have done that myself. I could have worked with my SMEs, but now I've got a nice draft that I can begin the process, and I could send that over to maybe my ISSOs, and I could say, please go through this and review it and make a determination on which of these learning objectives are relevant, which of them are powerful, so on and so forth. Super, super, super powerful relative to it. Okay, so that's the first one. I've only got 15 minutes, so this is like a lightning round. I got to move through this quick. Okay, so I showed you that. Now, let me show you another one. Let's talk about slide contents. I'm using the exact same Ryzen framework because I think it's so powerful to make sure that you narrow the scope of it, right? Role, instructions, steps, end goal, narrowing. Now, the difference here, just because I knew I had to do a little bit of a demo, and I went ahead and pre-populated a set of learning objectives that I had it construct previously. So you'll see those down here in a later section where I've got a parameter called learning objectives. So now what I want it to do is I say, as an ISSO course designer, develop slide content that effectively conveys the key concepts, responsibilities, and processes for ISSOs based on NIST SP 837 Rev 2, create succinct slide content covering RMF, blah, blah, blah. Review the learning objectives below. So it's going to go deeper into the prompt itself. It's going to capture all that information. I'm going to have it develop a list of 10 modules that correlate to the learning objectives. So now I know kind of the chapters. For each module, develop a list of 10 slides that reflect RMF phases and ISSO duties. For each slide, create 3 to 4 structured bullet points. Ensure alignment with the learning objectives and the NIST Special Publication 137. Keep content succinct. So now this is going to create my outline for me. So it's going to take my learning objectives that I have gotten approved by my ISSO or my team or whoever, my SMEs, and now I'm going to use this as the basis to draft my actual slide content. So let me go ahead and select all of that. I will paste that over here into, now I'm going to start a new chat. And the reason, I'll explain that in a little bit, but the reason I do that is I don't want it to inherit any of the prior output that it gave me. It's kind of like dealing with a different instance of the large language model, so it doesn't remember any of that history. Now, if you wanted it to encapsulate that, you would use that same chat. But because I've already got a different set of learning objectives that I had it previously create, I don't want it to confuse the two of them. So much like I did before, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to upload the 837 Rev 2. I'm going to paste this in here, and in much the same way, I'm going to wait for the little spinny wheel to finish. As it's thinking, it keeps going. It's not a small document, so it takes a little bit of time. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to tell it to process the prompt. Okay, it's going to read 837 Rev 2 again, and now it's going to begin the process of developing my different modules. Here's module 1, Introduction to RMF and ISSO role. Here's my slide 1 title. Here's my slide 1, 3 bullet points that it's going to create for me. Here's my slide 2. I mean, I think that's just so powerful. Again, I'm not advocating that this is done and ready to go, but from a drafting perspective, just realize that within like 3 minutes, I've got my learning objectives established, And I've actually got my my slide content already broken down. There's module 1, there's my module 2, and it's just going to go on. It's going to develop 10 different modules for this, for everything that I'm looking for. So I think that's super powerful. So that's my second one. Let me go to another one real quick. I'm just trying to be sensitive to time. Maybe you want to incorporate, you want to have it create case studies. Okay, same type of thing. I'm going to use my same framework. Now, what's a little different here is I'm going to go through and I'm going to have it basically incorporate continuous monitoring best practices. So it's going to basically write a case study around continuous monitoring. Maybe that was one of my modules that I had in my ISSO course, and that was the case, right? So I'm going to go ahead in much the same way. Select all. Let me go ahead and copy that. I'm going to start a new chat for the same reason. I'm going to go over here, upload from my computer. And then I'm going to paste. So I'm going to basically have it create a case study that presents a realistic cybersecurity scenario related to continuous monitoring and risk mitigation under the RMF. So it's going to provide the instructions, develop a case study based on real world situation that an ISO might encounter. The scenario should highlight challenges in security monitoring, risk analysis, incident response, and compliance. I'm going to click that and we'll see what's going to come out of it. Now, keep in mind that this is basically predictive. So it's not always going to be exactly the same every time you run these prompts, but it'll be similar in context. So here's my case study, continuous monitoring and risk mitigation in a federal agency. Basically, you'll notice that it's, here's my scenario. It's identifying the key players that are in it. It describes the situation that they actually ran into, the potential impact, any of the decision points. If you were to, I don't have time, but if I were to show you the way I put together that Ryzen template with all the parameters, you would see each of these areas articulated to some extent within that, where I told it to incorporate, hey, create a set of decision points that the student actually has to make and incorporate decisions around. There's a section in there, one of the steps is create a number of open-ended questions that correlate to the particular case study that force the student to basically have to process and try to apply that information in some kind of meaningful way. All right. And so anyways, so you'll see there's that. And then the last thing I'm going to show you, just because again, I'm trying to be sensitive to time, even though I could show you the labs, but is the quiz creation. I think this is super powerful. Again, same type of framework. I love the Ryzen template. I use it all the time because again, I'm trying to guarantee I'm getting the kind of the output that I'm looking for. This one here is going to have develop a 10-question multiple choice quiz with 4 possible answers. It's going to say analyze the module content at the end. Again, just for illustration purposes, I put all the module content down here so that, you know, it correlates to the outline so that at least it has an understanding of the topics that the student for this particular module has run into. I'm going to have it also review 837 Rev 2 to identify critical concepts, develop it, and make them an easy to moderate level of difficulty to assess their knowledge, and so on and so forth. So I could go in and I could copy this. Let me do that again. I'm going to start a new chat. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to upload 837. Now, again, you don't have to upload it, but I think it's so powerful because it makes sure that the large language model only is predominantly using the source document that I'm telling it to look at. Okay. And so after a few moments, it's almost done. There we go. And so now it's going to begin the process of creating my 10-question multiple choice quiz that's going to correlate to that. So there it is right there. So it's giving me the question, it's giving me my 4 possible answers, and it's even telling me what the answer is supposed to be. So again, as a course developer, I like having some kind of assessment for the purpose of correlating it back to what the student learned. So in my mind, I develop my learning objectives. I use my learning objectives to create my course content. I use the course content to determine my case studies, to measure applicability. And then I even created quizzes based on that particular module that correlates back to that to assess their actual knowledge. Super powerful, I think, in terms of the ability to to create content. So that's a couple different demonstrations. Calvin, if we could go back to the slides real quick. I'm just trying to be super sensitive to time. All right, so go ahead, and I went through just because I didn't want to go back and forth with use case 2, use case 3. So if we could go ahead a couple more slides, flip ahead through use case 5. We already showed the slides, the case studies, quizzes. Next one, if you would. All right, cool. All right, so now that I've kind of shown you some of the power, right, from a content perspective and what you can create with it, or at least draft with it, let's talk about some best practices or some leading practices. Now, the thing that's really, I think, really powerful about using large language models and generative AI for content creation is that not only does it potentially know about content, but it also knows about educational frameworks. So a lot of us, a lot of times, deal with things like the ADDIE model, or maybe we're the Bloom's taxonomy and those types of things. I can incorporate those into my prompts that I just basically showed you, so that if there was a particular area that I needed to measure against or to articulate against, I could basically do that. Next slide, please. Another one, and you saw me do this multiple times already, it's something that I do all the time, is upload your source materials, right? On some of the different, again, it depends on the subscription level that you're with and which versions of the large language models you're operating, but pretty much all of them now have the ability to have you be able to upload PDF documents, upload content relative to it. And I think it's just so powerful because what it does is it makes sure that the large language model understands the context by which you're operating in terms of your information. It also can provide traceability. I didn't get a chance to go through it, but if you were to go back and look, in a lot of cases, there'll be like a small little footnote there that you can click on, and it'll tell you where in the source document it actually pulled that information from. Like, was it 837, Rev 2, page 15, or whatever. And so that's, I think, really, really powerful. One of the challenges I will warn you about, you may have heard about it, is that a lot of these large language models can suffer from something called hallucinations. And a hallucination is where it might make something up or it might be incorrect with what it's telling you. And by uploading that source content that I'm talking about, whether it's, a standard or a document or what have you, you have a better likelihood that you're going to you really narrow that scope of what it's actually working with. Next slide, please. Also, I didn't really get a chance to mention it, but several of these large language models also have the ability to click on a button and tell it to incorporate the web search function into it. With these generative AI platforms, one of the challenges is their training data, in a lot of cases, may be somewhat limited. For example, Claude, that's one of the ones that's used like at DHS and some other different federal agencies. It's not trained past like April of 2024. So it's about 10 months old. Okay, now if you're working with something that's older, it's not that big of a deal, but if you needed current event kind of information, like if you wanted to pull in current events of what's going on in the real world, you wouldn't necessarily have that. So by incorporating that web search, you get a better likelihood that it's going to go out, do a bunch of queries, and basically then incorporate, the current state of where things are. I think that's super powerful. Next slide, please. This is also super important too. A lot of times people just put in, I want you to create this. But with these large language models, there is the ability to incorporate what are called chain of thought in your prompting. And that's what you kind of saw with my Ryzen methodology. And that's why I really wanted to use it as kind of the basis for demonstrating a lot of this. It is systematically going through and processing each of those in a sequential way. Like when you go through and you tell it roll, I want you to think about this from this perspective. I want you to do this. Then I want you to go to this step, and I want you to go to this step, and I want you to go to this step. That's very, very, very powerful. Some of the newer large language models that are out there today, like the O1 and the O3 LLMs that OpenAI has put out, incorporate reasoning functions built into it, but not all of them necessarily are. So if you get like the free version of ChatGPT and you're using just the 4.0, it doesn't by default. So you can incorporate that construct or that idea into what you're asking for it. Next slide, please. Another thing that I think is really powerful, and I didn't really get a chance to demonstrate it, but when you start to create, I mean, I did to some extent, but when you create content, what I oftentimes will do is I will isolate it into different like chats. You'll notice I kept creating a new chat, a new chat, a new chat. That's because I wanted to isolate content. I think that's very powerful. When we start to think about building course material, we have to think about this kind of in a multi-layer perspective where we've developed our learning objectives, we've got our outline, and then each one of those modules or chapters becomes its own kind of content area, and you want to make sure that you keep them isolated. You don't want them all running within one, because as I told you before, it has a tendency of reading everything previously. So if you can separate your modules into different chats, very powerful. So that way, if you got all of your slide content in module 1, then when you have it write a case study, it only uses the slide content from module 1 in the scenario. And then when it builds the quiz, like I talked about, it only uses that information from that module 1 chat. Next slide, please. This is so important. I kind of alluded to this. Keep in mind, we're only talking about drafting content. We're not finished product. You got to have subject matter expertise to review it. Every course I build, I go to the SME and I say, hey, can you please review this? And then have them go through when they want to make specific changes. Again, these large language models are not perfect. They are continuing to get better, but it's really important to always have some level of human oversight. Next slide, please. And then the last thing I'll tell you about in terms of leading practice I think is really powerful is just make sure you use the right kind of subscription. Some of these subscriptions allow for the large language models, for example, to train on your data. So you want to be careful about the kind of information you're uploading into it. Certain versions of like ChatGPT, like if you've got the Teams version or the enterprise version of it, they don't train on your information. So you could upload conceivably, as long as you're not violating organizational policy, but you could upload sensitive confidential information and it wouldn't basically train on it. But you just want to be aware of that, because by default, if you're like using the free version of ChatGPT, everything you're putting into it is basically being used to improve the model, which means if you put in a bunch of credit card numbers and social security numbers, that information unfortunately is going to get consumed. Next slide, please. All right, so I've used it already to create 5 federally focused courses. I'll spend just a moment and just kind of illustrate and show you. So just give me like maybe 30 seconds and then we'll be done, because I'm trying to be very cognizant of the time. Let's see here. So I'll just show you, here's a couple right here. I created a NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0 course using this that we ran. Students absolutely loved it. It did all of the content. It created, the course description. It created the outline, the learning objectives. It went through and created all of I had it even write all of the text that was down here. I can show you a couple things here. Let me just go here to like 36. We had it write these case studies like I talked about. Open-ended questions. I kind of illustrated that, showed that to you. I had to go through and write quizzes. So again, just super powerful. So I had it write a NIST CSF course. I had to write a NIST privacy framework course. Those are obviously public resources that you can upload into it. I had to write a generative AI for cyber auditing. How cool is that, right? I actually have taught this. I'm going to be teaching it in a couple of weeks. But it went through and developed the outline for me. It put together my learning objectives. It created all of my lab activities. I thought that was super powerful. Not only did it basically write the content, but then I had it turn around and write step-by-step lab activities that would illustrate those concepts, so that when the students are trying to figure out how to incorporate generative AI into their auditing activities, they can kind of see the kind of capabilities in terms of how they could use generative AI for compliance verification and data analysis and all kinds of really cool things. But I actually had ChatGPT write all of the labs. And like, for example, I can just quickly show you, if we go over here to like 72, this is the lab here that I had it write. It just shows basically how you can use ChatGPT to interpret and articulate data trends from summarized federal cybersecurity audit data. Of course, this isn't real data, it's just simulated data. But you're supposed to basically copy and paste all of this and then have it analyze the trends. And so it'll go through and use this fictitious data. So it wrote these lab activities. I told it what I wanted and it went through and built it. And then you then can copy and paste that in. And so I think it's just super powerful from that perspective to show a lot of the capabilities. And then also I did a FedRAMP workshop one, which I thought was really cool. We did that one as well too. So very, very similar. All of these are very similar. They have either lab activities or case studies. They have slide content. They have learning objectives, and all of those different types of things. Calvin, if you can bring the slides back up for just a second, and then we'll finish off. All right, so we went to that. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, if you're interested, there's a QR code. If you scan that, it'll take you out to a OneDrive link where I have the copy of those prompts that I was kind of showing you quickly. You can download them and you can use them, you can manipulate them, you can go through and it's got both the Ryzen template as well as the 5 that I kind of alluded to, the creating slide objectives, creating or learning objectives, creating slides, so on and so forth. So, and there's a copy of the presentation there if you're interested in it. Next slide, please. And there's my contact information. If I can help out in any way, feel free to reach out to me. I was kind of a very quick, rapid firestorm of content, but I was trying to get us done by 4 o'clock. What kind of questions?
Thank you, Mr. Wiggins. That is a great presentation. Thank you for sharing the Ryzen model and how you've been able to apply it. I think you had some really amazing examples. We do have a lot of questions, but unfortunately we are at time. So I will say, don't worry, if you wanted to answer them, you can do so afterwards, but I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up.
Okay.
So while I'm doing that, feel free to field the questions in text, or people can stay on later. All right, so this concludes the FISSEA Winter Forum. Just a few closing reminders. Please first complete the online evaluation for today's FISSEA Winter Forum. Click on the link provided in the Q&A. You can also visit the forum website to access the survey. Surveys are a great way for us to know how we're doing and if this content is valuable to you. It's also a great way to share with us what kind of information you'd like to hear about in the next forum. Second, just a reminder for ways that you can get more involved. Subscribe to the FISSEA mailing list, volunteer for the FISSEA Planning Committee, serve on the award or contest committees for 2025. You can also join or volunteer any of the above through the email by emailing FISSEA@nist.gov. You can also always present a presentation like the ones that you've seen today. So go ahead and submit your presentation for a proposal for a future FISSEA forum or a conference by clicking on https://www.surveymonkey.com/r/FISSEA call for presentations. And lastly, save the date for the FISSEA Spring Forum, which will be held on May 13th, 2025. This will be a virtual event. And thank you to all of our speakers who came out today. We had some really great conversations. We appreciate listening to all of the great knowledge that you had to provide for us today. And that concludes our FISSEA Winter Forum. Thank you so much.